This was the borderland. Somewhere around the year 1875, maybe 1880, it was a harsh seam stitched between what was left of Comanche territory and the new, raw town of San Miguel. The land itself did not care about maps. It was just prairie, endless and rolling, coughing up red dust that settled on everything, especially the lungs. It was a place of cattle, their ribs showing after the long dry spell, and the fresh, ugly scar of the new railroad ties heading west. Out here, the wind always howled, trying to shout down the crack of gunfire. Sometimes it was hard to tell which one held dominion. Abigail Monroe, known to most as Abby, was 19 years old. She was the daughter of a white rancher whose luck had run as dry as the creek bed. Her mother was long gone, buried under a pile of stones that the wind was slowly claiming. Abby worked like a man because there was no one else to do the work. She could ride until the sun bled out of the sky. She could rope a steer, and she could shoot. Her aim was passable, good enough to scare coyotes or, if need be, a man who got too familiar. But the world did not see the calluses on her hands. It saw a daughter, 19 years old, and therefore a girl to be married off. That was her purpose, according to the whispers in the church pews and the calculating glances of men in town. Her worth was measured not in acres she saved, but in the dowry she did not have. Her father, Elias Monroe, had once been a man full of warmth and loud songs, but the land takes its toll. The drought had taken the crops, the sickness had taken the cattle, and the debt had taken his spirit. Elias now found his comfort in a bottle of whiskey, and his words were often slurred or sharp, barbed with the bitterness of failure. Then there was Tommy. He was a boy of 10, maybe 12 years, all knobby knees and innocent eyes. He was the only piece of the old world, the soft world, that Abby had left. He was the one person on this earth for whom her heart broke clean open, no questions asked. Change was coming, and it arrived on iron rails. The railroad company and the speculators from back east wanted the land. They did not care if it belonged to a poor white farmer like Elias or to the Comanche tribe that had hunted it for generations. The people already here were just obstacles. The newspapers in San Miguel talked of progress and civilization, but to the Comanche, those words hung in the air like the blade of a guillotine. Government orders, soldiers, and new laws were always threatening to sweep them away. His name was Lone Hawk. In the Comanche tongue, it meant something strong. He was a warrior, perhaps 25 or 27 winters old. His people regarded him as brave, a man who had faced the blue-coated soldiers. But bravery did not fill a belly. He was poor now. The massacres had taken most of his kin, and the great herds were gone. He owned little more than a few horses and the ground he stood on. A pale scar, a souvenir from a cavalry saber, ran down the side of his jaw. He was a quiet man. Lone Hawk existed in the space between two worlds. He understood the English language, picked up in brutal negotiations and brief, failed treaties. He knew some of the white man's customs, enough to know he was despised. He did not belong fully to the old ways, and he would never be accepted by the new. San Miguel itself was just a cluster of raw lumber and false hopes. It had a saloon that was always loud, a small church that was mostly empty, and a sheriff's office with a bent iron stove. It had a livery stable and the advancing line of the railroad, promising wealth to men who already had it. San Miguel was a place where the white townsfolk looked upon the Comanche with a mixture of raw fear and deep, abiding contempt. The Comanche, when they looked back, returned the sentiment in equal measure. The man paid to keep the peace was Sheriff Clay Mercer. On the surface, he was all polished badges and stern justice. Beneath that, he was a creature of quiet greed. He was in deep with a man named Mr. Beckett, an agent for the railroad. They both wanted the valley. Their plan was simple: push the Comanche onto some useless, barren rock pile or into a reservation, and take the good land for themselves. But the threat was not just from the outside. Within the Comanche, there was Crow Ghost. He was a warrior who saw only one path war. He spat on the peace talks. He hated the white man, and he hated any Comanche, like Lone Hawk, who dared to speak of compromise. To him, any negotiation was a betrayal written in blood. Abby felt the walls closing in. A part of her, a wild, secret part, yearned for freedom. She wanted to ride west until her horse gave out, to see the ocean she had only read about in a torn book, to decide her own life. But she was caught. She was chained by duty, chained to the ranch, to the mounting debt her father ignored, and most of all, to Tommy. What would happen to her brother if she left? She was trapped, too, by the unwritten law of the land a daughter must obey. A daughter must be quiet. A daughter must do as she is told. The sun was bleeding out, painting the high clouds in shades of orange and bruised purple. Abby was riding alone. Her horse, Old Patch, picking his way across the prairie. She had pushed the small herd into the west pasture, and the silence was a welcome relief. Then she saw them. On the far horizon, a line of riders. They were dark shapes against the dying light, moving with a fluid grace that seemed part of the wind itself. Comanche. Her hand instinctively went to the rifle in her scabbard, but she did not pull it. They were too far, and they were moving away, parallel to her path. One rider, at the lead, sat straighter than the others. He was too distant to make out any features, only the shape of him, the way he sat his horse as if he were born to it. It was Lone Hawk. For a single, held breath, their paths crossed. He did not turn his head, but she felt the weight of his presence across the expanse. Or perhaps he did glance her way, a flicker of attention too brief to be certain. Abby stopped her horse. She watched them until they were just specks, swallowed by the twilight. A shiver ran down her spine. It was not just fear, it was something else, something she could not name. It was a terrible, aching curiosity about the very wildness that everyone in San Miguel paid Sheriff Mercer to keep at bay. She turned her horse toward the dim lights of the ranch, the feeling of that vast, untamed freedom clinging to her like dust. The drought did not break. It settled in, a mean and permanent guest, sucking the last of the moisture from the earth until the ground cracked open like a parched lip. At the Monroe Ranch, the water holes dried to mud, then to fissured clay. The cattle grew thin, their hides clinging to their bones. And then the sickness came. It moved through the herd like a ghost, leaving stiff-legged corpses bloating in the weak sun. Elias Monroe watched it all, his face hardening. With every animal he lost, the numbers on the ledger in Sheriff Clay Mercer's office grew larger. Elias was not just in debt, he was owned. The interest was high, a cruel figure that Mercer and his silent partners, the real loan sharks, had set. Elias had borrowed against the land, then against the herd, and then against his own signature, which was now worthless. Mercer and the railroad man, Mr. Beckett, did not want the cattle. They wanted the land, the Monroe Ranch, worthless as it was for grazing, sat squarely on the proposed route for the new rail line. It was an inconvenience that needed to be swept away. They cornered Elias in the back room of the saloon, not the public bar, but the small, smoky room where the real business of San Miguel was done. Mr. Beckett did the talking. He was a man in a clean suit, and he smelled of bay rum, a scent that was offensive in a town that smelled of dust and manure. Elias, he began, placing a single unlit cigar on the table. We have a problem. Your notes are past due, months past due. The drought, Elias mumbled, his eyes on the cigar. The sickness. I need more time. Sheriff Mercer, who had been leaning against the doorframe, pushed himself off. He was a big man, and he filled the small room. Time has run out. Elias, he said, his voice a low rumble. The bank, my associates, they want their money. I cannot hold them off. What can I do? Elias asked, his voice cracking. As it stands, Beckett said, inspecting his fingernails, we will be forced to foreclose, take the land, everything. You and the children will be evicted. Evicted? Where will we go? Mercer grunted. That is not our concern. There are laws. Debtor's prison is not out of the question. Or perhaps indentured servitude. To work off the debt, a man, a girl, a small boy. The railroad always needs labor. Elias turned pale. The threat was plain. They would not just take his home. They would break his family, sell them like livestock. Please, he whispered. Anything. Beckett let the word hang in the air. He smiled, a thin, precise expression. That is better. Now, we do have a solution, a way for you to clear a significant portion of this debt. It is unconventional, but these are modern times. He leaned forward. The railroad wants progress. Elias, but progress must be seen as benevolent. We are having some difficulties with the Comanche. They claim the valley is theirs. It is, Elias said, before he could stop himself. Beckett's eyes narrowed. It is an obstacle. We need to show the government, the newspapers back east, that we are not tyrants. We are partners with the native inhabitants. We need a gesture of peace. What gesture? Elias asked, dread coiling in his stomach. A marriage, Beckett said. A union. A white daughter of San Miguel, joined in holy matrimony with a Comanche brave. It would be a powerful symbol. The company would be very grateful to the family that provided such a symbolic bridge. Grateful enough to forget, say, 90% of their outstanding debt. Elias stared. A marriage. My Abby. She is of age, is she not? Mercer said. 19. Here. Pretty girl. It is a waste to have her roping cattle when she could be building bridges. To a savage, Elias was horrified. Not just any savage, Mercer said. Taking over. He knew the local players. There is one, Lone Hawk. You have heard of him. He is considered brave by his people, but he is poor. Lost most of his family. He has even led a few peace talks. Some of the white folks almost respect him. He is the perfect choice. He is caught between worlds, which makes him manageable. No, Elias said, I cannot. She is my daughter. She is your asset, Beckett corrected him, his voice like ice. And you are about to lose her, and your son, and this ranch, to a work camp. This is your only way out. Elias, a peace marriage. You will be a hero. The man who saved the town from an Indian war and cleared his name. Elias Monroe stumbled home hours later. The bottle of whiskey he had purchased with his last coin was half empty. The moon was high, casting the failed ranch in a ghostly white light. He found Abby in the kitchen, mending Tommy's shirt by the light of a single candle. Abby, he slurred, bracing himself against the door frame. She looked up, her needle stopping mid-stitch. She saw the look in his eyes, the familiar mix of alcohol and self-pity. But tonight, there was something new. There was a terrible, hollowed-out resolve. Pa, you are late. Tommy is already asleep. He is a good boy, Elias said, his voice thick. He deserves this land. He deserves a future. What have you done? Pa, Abby asked. Putting the shirt down. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. I have saved us, he said. He pushed himself into the room and sat heavily at the table. I have made a deal. The debt, most of it will be gone. Abby waited. She knew there was a price. There was always a price. They want the land. Abby, Mercer, and that railroad man. They were going to take it all. Put us out. Take Tommy. And she whispered, they need a sign of peace to stop the trouble with the Comanche. He could not look at her. He stared at the flickering candle. A marriage. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the crickets outside seemed to stop. A marriage, Abby repeated. A peace marriage. It is the only way to save the ranch, to save Tommy. Who, Pa? She asked, though she already knew. Who are they making you sell me to? He is a Comanche, Elias said, the words rushing out. A warrior. They say he is a good man. Lone Hawk. You will be married. To save this family. Abby felt the blood drain from her face. It was not shock. It was a cold, sharp, and sudden emptiness. She had expected to be sold, perhaps to some old rancher or a banker from town. But this... No, she said, "It is done." Elias slammed his fist on the table, making the candle jump. "You will do it." "I will not," she said, her voice rising, the fire returning to her. "I am not a head of cattle. You cannot sell me to a savage. I will not go." Elias stood, his face purpled with rage and shame. He raised his hand, and for a second, she thought he would strike her. He did not. He used words instead, and they hit harder. "You are a daughter," he roared, his voice breaking. "This is for men to decide. You will do as I say. You will save your brother from a life of hard labor. You will save this house. Or, by God, I will drag you to him myself." He turned and stumbled into his room, slamming the door. The bottle he carried smashed against the wall. Abby stood frozen in the kitchen. The fury was so strong it made her shake. A white-hot rage at her father, at Mercer, at this entire cursed land. But beneath the rage was a colder, deeper current, fear. She thought of Tommy, sleeping in the next room, his breathing soft and untroubled, the image of him being taken, of his small hands cut and calloused in a railroad camp, broke through her anger. She sank onto the stool, her hands clenched in her lap. She thought of the Comanche. She remembered the stories the women whispered in town. Savages, brutal men who took what they wanted, men who smelled of smoke and blood. And she was being given to one, a poor one, like a piece of meat tossed to a dog. Across the prairie, under the same indifferent moon, Sheriff Mercer and Mr. Beckett rode toward the cluster of Comanche lodges by the dry creek. They brought cheap blankets, a few bags of flour, and a bottle of whiskey. The Comanche elders met them in the open air, their face lit by a central fire. Crow Ghost stood at the back, his arms crossed, his eyes full of hatred. Beckett, unused to diplomacy without walls, made his proposal. He spoke of peace. He spoke of two great peoples joining. He spoke of the honor of a white daughter marrying a brave warrior. Lone Hawk stood beside the eldest, a man whose face was a map of wrinkles and sorrows. When Beckett finished, the camp was silent. Then Lone Hawk spoke, his English slow and measured. "You come here. You take our land. You kill the buffalo. And now you offer us one of your women, as a gift." "As a bride," Beckett corrected smoothly. "For you, Lone Hawk, we have chosen you, a man of honor, to join with the daughter of Elias Monroe." "I will not buy a white wife," Lone Hawk said. His voice was not loud, but it carried, "Your laws are not my laws. Your gifts are not my gifts. Take your blankets and go." Crow Ghost laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "The white man's lapdog does not want the white woman." Mercer shifted, his hand moving toward his pistol. But the old elder raised a hand. He turned to Lone Hawk and spoke, not in English, but in the soft, flowing language of their people. "My son," he said, "your pride is right, but your eyes are closed. Look at what they are doing. They are not offering a gift. They are showing us their next weapon. They want our land. They will take it with bullets, or they will take it with paper." "This is a paper trick," Lone Hawk said. "It is," the elder agreed, "but it is a trick we can also use. If you take this woman, you become a bridge. You will have a voice, a place at their tables. They will have to listen to the man who married one of their own. You will have standing. You can protect this valley, our ancestors' graves, in a way your arrows cannot." Lone Hawk looked at the old man, his teacher. He saw the weariness in his eyes, the desperation. The elder was not asking him to surrender. He was asking him to fight a different kind of war. "She is innocent," Lone Hawk said, his voice dropping. "We are all innocent until the new world comes for us," the elder said. "You must do this. For the people." The meeting broke. Mercer and Beckett rode back to town, satisfied. Later that night, Lone Hawk walked to the top of a small bluff, He stood for a long time, looking east. In the distance, he could see the faint, flickering lights of San Miguel. He knew that in one of those houses, a white girl, 19 years old, was being pulled into a game neither of them had chosen. He looked down at his hands, scarred and calloused. He was a warrior, but he had been asked to lay down his lance. He had been asked to accept a life, a woman. He did not want all to protect the ghosts of his past. He closed his eyes, and he made his choice. The wedding was not a celebration. It was a transaction, staged at the dusty edge of town where San Miguel's ambitions gave way to the open prairie. It was an awkward, bitter affair. A few Comanche relatives of Lone Hawk stood on one side, their faces like carved stone. Watching, on the other, a gaggle of townsfolk, drawn by the spectacle, whispered behind their hands. The preacher from San Miguel's small church, a nervous man named Reverend Pike, rushed through his words. He held his Bible as if it might shield him, his voice thin against the constant wind. He spoke of two peoples joining, but his eyes kept darting to the Comanche warriors, and his sweat stained the collar of his black coat. When he finished, the Comanche elder stepped forward. He did not speak English. He chanted, his voice low and sonorous, a sound that seemed to rise from the dry earth itself. He lit a braid of sweetgrass, and the smoke, sacred and unfamiliar, drifted over Abby, over Lone Hawk, and over the giggling, contemptuous crowd. "Look at that," a woman whispered, loud enough for all to hear. "She is pretty, in a ragged sort of way. What a waste, given to a poor Comanche." "Poor is right," a man chuckled. "He has not got two ponies to rub together, but I suppose he will keep her warm." Abby heard them. She stood rigid, her body a column of silent, frozen protest. She was wearing her mother's wedding dress. It was an old-fashioned thing, made of ivory lace that had yellowed with time. It had been meant for a church, for love, for a different life. Now, it felt like a shroud. Her hands, calloused from work, trembled, and she clenched them at her sides. Her eyes were cold. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. This was the first time she had seen him up close. Lone Hawk. He was not the savage monster of the town's nightmares. He was not the hulking, bloodthirsty brute she had been taught to fear. He was just a man. He was thin, his body lean and hard. His skin burned the color of copper by a lifetime under the sun. His black hair was long, held back by a simple leather band. The scar on his jaw was pale and clean. His eyes were what held her. They were deep and dark, and filled with a profound, unreadable sadness. He was, as the townspeople had mocked, clearly poor. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a shirt. The only things of value on him were a necklace of polished bone and the sheathed knife at his hip. He looked at her, once, his gaze direct and unsettling. It was not a look of desire. It was a look of assessment, of shared misfortune. Reverend Pike cleared his throat. "And do you, Abigail Monroe, take this man?" She felt her father's presence behind her, the sour smell of whiskey and desperation. She felt Tommy, standing beside Elias, his small hand clutching his hat. She looked at her brother, and her carefully constructed wall of ice cracked. Tommy was crying, his small face screwed up, silent tears streaming down his cheeks. He was trying to be brave, but he was terrified. He was terrified of losing her. Abby's heart seized. She was doing this for him, to keep that small, trembling boy safe in his bed, to keep the roof over his head. "To be your lawfully wedded husband," the preacher finished, his voice trailing off. Abby tore her gaze from Tommy and looked forward, at the dry grass, at the nothingness. She felt the hatred rise in her, hot and acidic. Hatred for her father's weakness, hatred for Mercer's greed, and a deep, burning hatred for herself, for being so weak, for not finding another way, for failing to protect her own freedom. "I do," she whispered. The wind snatched the words from her lips. Sheriff Clay Mercer and Mr. Beckett, standing off to the side, looked immensely pleased. They did not see a human tragedy. They saw a brilliant political maneuver. Beckett even had a man with a large, boxy camera, capturing the historic moment. The flash of powder made Abby flinch. "Excellent," Beckett said, stepping forward as soon as the elder had finished. He produced a piece of paper, a document penned in official ink. A legal marriage. Under the laws of the United States, a true joining. Lone Hawk said nothing. He signed his name, not with an X as Abby had expected, but with a slow, deliberate signature. Elias Monroe, his hand shaking, scrawled his own name, sealing the bargain. It was over. There was no feast. There was no celebration. The Comanche turned without a word and mounted their horses. A horse was brought for Abby, a sturdy mare with a resigned look in her eyes. Lone Hawk gestured for her to mount. Her father, Elias, would not meet her gaze. He just put his hand on Tommy's shoulder and pulled him away. Abby, her mother's lace dress hiked up, swung herself into the saddle. She was a good rider, and she would not give them the spectacle of her needing help. They rode for 2 hours, away from San Miguel, away from the railroad, into the heart of the dry. Red land. Lone Hawk rode at the front, his back straight. Abby rode behind him. No one spoke. They arrived at his camp just as the sun was setting. The word camp was generous. It was a single lodge, a teepee made of patched hides. A few scrawny horses were tied near a dry stream bed. A small fire pit held cold ashes. Abby's heart sank. The mocking words of the townswoman came back to her. Poor Comanche. It had not been an insult. It had been a simple statement of fact. This man had nothing. He lived in a wind-beaten lodge on a patch of barren ground. He truly had nothing but the sky and the dirt. He dismounted and motioned for her to do the same. He took the reins of her horse and tied it with his own, then began to rub the animal down, his movements economical and practiced. He did not look at her. Abby stood by the cold fire pit, the yellowed lace of her dress a grotesque mockery in this setting. The sun was gone, and the cold of the high prairie descended immediately. She shivered, from the cold, from the fear, from the sheer, crushing loneliness of her situation. What now? This was the night, her wedding night. She had been raised a proper, if poor, young woman. She knew what was expected. She had heard the whispered, horrifying stories from other girls about what husbands did, and her imagination had filled in the rest, painting the act with the brutal colors of the tales told about savages. She expected violence, she expected pain, she expected to be treated like the property she was. After what felt like an eternity, Lone Hawk finished with the horses. He walked to the lodge and pushed aside the hide flap. He looked at her. He said it was the first word he had spoken to her. Her legs felt like lead. Her heart was a trapped bird, beating against her ribs. But she had no choice. Her father's words echoed in her ears. "You are a daughter. This is for men to decide." She walked past him and into the darkness of the lodge. It was small inside. A few furs were piled on one side. A small, cold fire pit was in the center. It smelled of dust, smoke, and something else, something wild and male. She stood in the center, her hands clenched, waiting. Lone Hawk entered after her, and the lodge seemed to shrink. He was a tall man. He let the flap fall, plunging them into near-total darkness, broken only by the faint moonlight filtering through the smoke hole at the top. Abby stopped breathing. This was it. He did not move toward her. Instead, she heard him moving on the far side of the lodge. There was a sound of scraping flint, and a moment later, a small spark caught on a piece of tinder. He lit a single, thin tallow candle, and the lodge was filled with weak, flickering light. He was kneeling by his sleeping furs. He looked at her, his face half in shadow, his dark eyes unreadable. She tensed, bracing for him to stand, to cross the small space, to take what he had bought. Instead, He remained kneeling. He slowly, deliberately, reached to his side. Abby flinched, thinking he was reaching for a weapon. He pulled his knife from its sheath. It was a long, sharp blade, glinting in the candlelight. He looked at the knife, then he looked at her. He placed it on the dirt floor between them. Next, he reached behind him and picked up another object. It took her eyes a moment to adjust. It was a bridle, a leather bridle with a good, strong bit. He placed the bridle on the floor next to the knife. Abby stared at the two objects, confused. A knife and a bridle. Then Lone Hawk spoke. His English was slow, careful, each word separated by a breath. It was a low, rough voice, a voice that was not used to gentle things. "If in the morning," he said, his eyes holding hers, "you want to leave, take my fastest horse, the gray one. You take this," he pointed to the bridle, "and this," he pointed to the knife. "You go. I will tell them you died, a snake or the fever. I will tell them you are buried. I will bear the lie. Not you." He watched her for a moment longer, to make sure she understood. Abby was so stunned. She could not move, could not speak. Then he stood up. He did not take his furs. He took nothing. He simply turned, pushed aside the hide flap, and stepped out into the cold night air. He let the flap fall closed, leaving her alone inside. Abby stood in the silence. She stared at the closed flap. She stared at the knife. She stared at the bridle. He was gone. He had left her. She stumbled to the pile of furs and sat down, her legs giving way. She was shaking, but not from fear. It was shock, a profound, bone-deep shock that rattled her to her very soul. She had been taught her entire life that these people were savages, that they were brutal, violent, and without mercy. She had been prepared for the worst night of her life. She had been prepared to be hurt, to be broken, to be used. And on her wedding night, the savage she had been sold to had done the one thing no civilized man had ever done. He had given her a choice. He had given her the means to escape. He had offered her his fastest horse, a knife for protection, and even a lie to cover her tracks, a lie that would put him in danger with his own people and hers. Abby sat in the dark for hours. The candle burned down, guttered, and went out. She did not sleep. She listened to the sound of the wind outside the lodge. She heard the soft stamp and nicker of the horses, and, faintly, she could hear the crackle of a fire. He was out there, sleeping by a fire, leaving her the shelter of the lodge. Her hand went to the knife. She picked it up. The hilt was smooth, worn wood. The blade was cold. She held it in her lap, her mind racing. She could go. At first light, she could take the gray horse, the knife, and the bridle. She could ride away. But where would she go? Back to San Miguel, back to her father, who had sold her back to Sheriff Mercer and Mr. Beckett, who would see her as a failed experiment, a piece of property that had run away. They would just catch her. They would drag her back here. Or, worse, carry out their threat to send her and Tommy to a work camp. Her escape would ruin her brother. There was no home for her in San Miguel. Could she ride somewhere else west? She had no money, no food, no map. She was a lone woman, and the prairie was not kind. She would be dead in a week, from starvation, or thirst, or from the kind of men who preyed on lost women. She was trapped. She had always been trapped. But tonight, something was different. The man outside, the man who was now her husband by law, had not put her in this trap. He was in it with her, and he had shown her a respect, a kind of honor she had never known. He had not laid a hand on her. He had given her his knife and his horse and his word. A strange, unfamiliar feeling settled in her chest. It was not gratitude. It was not love. It was a fragile, terrifying tendril of curiosity. She lay down on the furs, pulling one over her for warmth, the knife still clutched in her hand. She did not sleep, but she rested. She listened to the sounds of the night, no longer as enemies, but just as sounds: the wind, the horses, the fire, the man. The first gray light of dawn crept through the smoke hole. Abby sat up. She had not moved all night. The knife was in her hand. The bridle was where he had left it. She heard a sound outside. The hide flap was pushed aside. Lone Hawk stood in the opening, framed against the pale, cold morning sky. He looked at her. He saw her, awake, sitting on the furs. His gaze dropped to the knife in her hand, then to the bridle on the floor. Then his eyes met hers. He did not speak. She did not speak. He saw that she was still there. The knife was unused. The fastest horse was still tied outside. A silent understanding passed between them. She had not chosen to go. And in not choosing to go, she had, in a way, chosen to stay. He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. A single, sharp inclination of his head. He turned and left the opening, going to tend the fire. Abby slowly uncurled her fingers from the hilt of the knife. She set it down. She knew, with a sudden and jarring certainty, that her life had just split in two. The world before this morning, and the world after, and she had no idea what came next. The first days were a blur of awkwardness and biting dust. Abby, in her mother's ruined wedding dress, was a stark, pale figure against the red earth. The Comanche camp, which consisted of Lone Hawk's lodge and a few others belonging to his remaining kin, was a place of quiet, constant industry, and she was useless. She did not know how to scrape a hide. She did not know how to find the bitter roots the women dug for. The food they ate was foreign tough, smoked jerky that she chewed until her jaw ached, and a thin corn mush that tasted like ash. She was used to a hard life, but this was a different kind of hard. It was a life lived on the very edge of survival, with no room for error. At night, she slept on the pile of furs inside the lodge. Lone Hawk continued to sleep outside by the fire. The arrangement was a silent, unspoken truce. He was giving her space, but the space felt vast and cold. The other Comanche watched her. The few women, widows like Lone Hawk's aunt, observed her with flat, impassive expressions. They saw a white doll, a political token. They saw her soft, pale hands, hands that had roped cattle but had never brained a rabbit. She was a burden. The warriors were worse, especially Crow Ghost. He would ride by, his face painted in a way that made her stomach clench, and he would spit on the ground near her feet. He spoke in the Comanche tongue, but his meaning was clear. His eyes were full of a burning hatred that included her people, and Lone Hawk for bringing her there. Lone Hawk was patient, in his silent, unnerving way. He seemed to understand that her farm-bred skills were useless here. He began to teach her, not with words, but with actions. One morning, he handed her a pair of worn buckskin leggings and a tunic. They had belonged to his mother. They were soft, smoked, and smelled of the lodge. Abby put them on, bundling her lace dress away. The buckskin was a relief, a practical armor. He took her out onto the prairie. He did not speak. He knelt and pointed. He showed her how to read the land. He pointed to a faint depression in the dirt, a nearly invisible mark. "Deer," he said. He showed her a broken twig. "Man, 3 hours. Heavy." He taught her to read the story that the earth was always telling. He led her to a patch of dry, cracked ground. It looked hopeless, but he knelt, dug with his knife, and uncovered a thick, pale root. He cut a piece and handed it to her. It was moist, and the water it held was bitter, but it was water. He taught her how to find life where she had only seen death. Her long, unruly hair was always in her face, catching the wind and the dust. One day, he watched her struggle, swatting at the strands. He took a leather thong from his own pouch. He stood behind her. She tensed, her whole body rigid. His fingers brushed her hair, and it was the first time they had touched. His hands were rough, but his touch was impersonal. efficient. He swiftly and tightly braided her hair, pulling it back from her face. When he was done, he stepped away. "Better," he said. He saw her watching his rifle, the old repeater she had brought. It was heavy, and the ammunition was scarce. He presented her with a short, powerful bow. It was made of sinew and wood, small enough for a person on horseback. He set up a target, a tuft of grass. She tried, and the arrow clattered uselessly to the ground, barely halfway. She, who could shoot a rifle, was a child with this weapon. He adjusted her stance. He moved her arm. "Here," he said, his fingers briefly pressing her elbow. "Pull. Not with the arm, with the back." She tried again, and again. For days. He never showed frustration. He simply waited, and she, in her pride, refused to give up. The tension with Crow Ghost finally broke. He and a few of his followers rode into Lone Hawk's small camp. Crow Ghost dismounted and strode toward Abby, who was trying to grind corn on a flat stone. He stood over her, his shadow falling across her. He spoke in English, for her benefit, his voice dripping with contempt. "White woman," he said, "the land they bought with you. Is it sweet? Does the cheap trade for our fathers' graves taste good?" Abby froze, her hand gripping the grinding stone. "Leave her," Lone Hawk said. He had appeared from the lodge, his voice quiet, but it cut through the air. Crow Ghost turned, a sneer on his face. "You protect your pet, the white dog you bought." "She is my wife," Lone Hawk said. The words were a flat statement of fact, not a declaration of love, but they were a line drawn in the sand. "She is a stain," Crow Ghost shouted, his voice rising. "She is the weakness that will kill us all. You are no Comanche. You are a yes man to the white soldiers." Lone Hawk did not move, but his hand drifted to the knife at his hip. "You are in my camp, Crow Ghost. You will not speak to her. You will not look at her. Leave, now." The two men stared at each other. The air crackled. Abby watched, terrified, as Crow Ghost's hand twitched toward his own weapon. Finally, after a long, agonizing silence, Crow Ghost let out a sharp, barking laugh. He spat on the ground, a dark gob of tobacco juice that landed near Abby's foot. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, his followers trailing him. Lone Hawk stood watching him go, his body still tense. The confrontation had solidified Abby's position. She was not just an outsider, she was a target, and her only protector was a man who was now considered a traitor by his own people. That night, Abby found it hard to breathe. She felt ashamed, not just of Crow Ghost's hatred, but of her own past. She sat by the fire, watching the flames, and for the first time, she truly saw the people around her. She had been taught they were savages, but she saw Lone Hawk's aunt, her face a map of grief, carefully sewing a small moccasin for a child who was not even hers. She saw the children, skinny and dusty, but they played, they laughed, they chased each other around the lodges, they fell, they cried, and they were comforted. She saw the old men, sitting together, telling stories, their hands moving as they spoke, passing on the memory of a world that was vanishing. These were not monsters. They were families. They were people, just as poor, just as trapped, and just as afraid as she was. And her people, the people in San Miguel, were the ones with the power, the soldiers, and the greed. The shame of her old prejudices sat in her stomach like a cold stone. The sky had been a pale, sick yellow all day. The wind had stopped, and the air was thick, heavy, and still. The horses were nervous, stamping and pulling at their tethers. Lone Hawk had been watching the horizon. "It comes," he said, his voice low. "What comes?" Abby asked. "The wind," he said, "the red wind." It started as a low whistle, a distant moan. Then the horizon vanished, erased by a rolling, churning wall of dark red dust. It was not a storm. It was an ocean, a tidal wave of grit and earth, and it was coming straight for them. "The lodge hold the flap," Lone Hawk yelled. The wind hit them. It was not a gust. It was a solid, physical blow. The air turned dark red. The sun blotted out. The sound was a deafening, constant scream. Dust was everywhere, in her eyes, her nose, her mouth. She could not breathe. She heard a crack, and the lodgepole groaned. "It will not hold," Lone Hawk shouted over the din. He grabbed her arm. "The children, the horses to the rocks." He half dragged her through the blinding storm. She saw his aunt already herding the two small children toward a cluster of large boulders. The air was so thick with dust she could barely see her own hands. "The horses!" Lone Hawk roared. "Untie them, or they will break their legs." He fought his way to the terrified animals, his knife out, slashing at the tethers. Abby, moving on instinct, grabbed the lead rope of her own mare. A small boy, no older than 5, was cowering by the dry creek bed, his eyes wide with terror. The main pole of the lodge snapped, and the hide structure collapsed in on itself. A dying animal. Abby ran, grabbing the child's arm and pulling him. "Come on," she screamed. She hauled him up, and together she, Lone Hawk, his aunt, and the two children huddled in a shallow crevice between two massive boulders. The horses, now free, turned their backs to the wind, their heads low, enduring. The storm howled around them for hours. It was a primal, terrifying force. Stripping the land bare, they huddled together in the rock crevice. It was not deep, but it offered a small break from the wind's full force. Night fell, but the darkness was the same, just colder. The wind was still screaming. The small boy was shaking, a high, thin wail of fear in his throat. "He is cold," Lone Hawk's aunt said, her voice hoarse. Lone Hawk had one thick buffalo robe. He pulled it from his pack. "Here," he said. He wrapped it around his aunt and the two children, bundling them together. Now he and Abby were left with only their thin tunics. The temperature was dropping fast. The wind cut through the buckskin as if it were not there. Abby began to shake, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw itched. Lone Hawk looked at her. He was shaking, too. "We will freeze," he said. "What?" she shouted over the wind. "We will freeze. We must share warmth, or we die." He did not wait for her answer. He pushed her back against the rock face, then pressed his own body against hers, shielding her from the wind. He was a solid, surprisingly warm presence. He pulled the edge of his tunic around her shoulder. "Do not fight," he said, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "Just be still." Abby was pressed against him, chest to back. It was an intimacy so sudden, so raw, it stole her breath. But it was not sexual. It was desperate. It was two animals huddling for warmth, trying to survive a force that wanted to kill them both. His heart beat a steady, slow rhythm against her back. They stayed that way for hours, in the screaming dark. The wind was their only world. After a long time, the wind seemed to lessen, or perhaps they had just grown numb to it. The silence was in their heads. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was close to her ear, the first time he had ever spoken to her in such a private way. "I am cold," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know." They were quiet again. The proximity was strange. She could smell him, the scent of smoke and dust, and something else, something uniquely him. "You dreamed," he said, his voice soft. "What?" "In the lodge, you dream, you talk." Abby felt a flush of embarrassment. "What did I say?" "A name, Mama, and maps. You said, 'I need to see the map.'" She was silent. She had not spoken of her dreams to anyone, not since her mother died. I wanted to draw them," she said, her voice small. "My mother had a book. From the East. It had pictures of the ocean, of mountains, I wanted to see them. I wanted to draw the maps of where I had been. Maps, he said, the word sounding strange in his mouth. The white man's map is a line. To say, this is mine. Our map is a story. To say, this is where we lived. My father's land, she said, bitterness creeping in. It was just a line on a map, to be sold. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, the buffalo are gone. My father, my brothers, they were killed by men with maps, men who said this land was theirs, because a line was drawn in a place we had never seen. He spoke of his people, not as a proud warrior, but as a man grieving. He told her about the slaughter, the sickness, the slow, grinding poverty. Crow Ghost is right, in his heart, he said, so quietly she almost missed it. The anger is right, but his path is death. He wants to fight, but we are too few. We are ghosts already, and he wants to fight the storm. And you, she asked, turning her head just enough to be heard. What do you want? He paused. I want to live. I want my people to have a fire and food for their children. I do not want to kneel, but I am tired of burying my kin. He had been caught, just as she was, caught between a world that was dead and a world that would not have him. Abby realized something, there in the dark, pressed against the man she had been forced to marry. Her old idea of freedom, of riding away and seeing the ocean, had been a child's dream. It was just running. She looked at Lone Hawk. Though she could not see his face, he was not free. He was chained to his people, to his past, to this land, but he was trying to save its soul. She realized freedom was not just about leaving. It was about being seen. It was about being given a choice. He had given her that on their wedding night, a knife and a bridle. He, a savage, had respected her more than her own father. The wind finally died in the small hours before dawn. The world was scoured clean, and the air was achingly cold. They unwrapped themselves, stiff and sore. His aunt and the children were still huddled, asleep. As the first light hit the valley, they crawled out of the crevice. The camp was gone. The lodge was a pile of torn hides and snapped poles. The land was flat, empty, and red. But they were alive. 2 days later, they had managed to raise a small, temporary shelter from the wreckage. Abby was helping Lone Hawk's aunt search for scattered supplies when a small Comanche girl, the one Abby had pulled from the storm's path, approached her. The girl, who was perhaps 4 years old, held out a small, polished stone. Abby knelt. For me, she asked. The girl nodded shyly. Abby smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. Thank you. It is beautiful. She pointed to the stone. Stone. The girl giggled. Tomo, she said, pointing to the stone in her own language. Stone, Abby repeated, pointing at the rock. Then she pointed to herself. Abby, the girl repeated, giggling. Abby laughed, a sound that felt rusty in her own throat. She chased the girl for a few steps, and the girl shrieked with delight. From across the ruined camp, Lone Hawk was securing a new pole. He stopped, watching. He saw his wife, her hair in a practical braid, her face smudged with dust, laughing as she chased a child. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. He said nothing. He just watched, and for a moment, the heavy weight on his shoulders felt a fraction lighter. In San Miguel, the dust storm had been a mere inconvenience, a day to shut the windows and drink in the saloon. For Sheriff Clay Mercer and Mr. Beckett, it had been a productive delay. With the air cleared, their real work began. Mr. Beckett unfurled a fresh map in the sheriff's office. It was a beautiful, clean document, full of precise lines and surveyor's marks. This is it, Clay, Beckett said, tapping a long finger on the paper. The route is perfect. It cuts straight through the valley, shaves 20 miles off the southern bend. That valley, Mercer said, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey, is what the Comanche call their sacred ground. Their ancestors are buried there. Then their ancestors will have the distinct pleasure of hearing the 4:15 train to California pass by every afternoon, Beckett said, accepting the glass. It is prime land. Good water. Level ground. We are taking it. The marriage was supposed to smooth this over, Mercer said, sitting back in his chair, his boots on his desk. And it has, Beckett said, his voice bright. It is a public relations masterpiece. I have already sent the dispatch back east. Pioneering railroad company brokers peace between settlers and savages. We have photographs. We have a marriage certificate. We have Elias Monroe's signature. By the time the government in Washington hears any complaints, they will have our report, detailing how we have already civilized the region through peaceful union. The marriage of Lone Hawk and the Monroe girl is our proof that the Comanche are cooperating. And what about the girl's father? Mercer asked, gesturing with his glass toward the town. Elias Beckett shrugged. He has been paid. A small stipend, enough to keep him quiet and in liquor. He is a broken man. He will be no trouble. Elias Monroe was indeed no trouble. He had taken the railroad's money. It was not enough to clear his debt, only enough to ensure his silence. The guilt, however, was a heavier burden than the debt had ever been. He haunted the saloon, a ghost in a worn coat, drinking from sunup until he could no longer stand. He talked to himself, to the empty glass, and sometimes to the ghost of his wife. He muttered his daughter's name, Abby, over and over, like a prayer for forgiveness that he knew would never be answered. He was a man consumed by shame, and therefore easily manipulated. The news came to the Comanche camp not as a formal declaration, but as a whisper carried on the wind. A trader, a half-breed named Joseph, who sometimes did business with Lone Hawk's people, rode in with a pack mule loaded with salt and beads. He and Lone Hawk spoke for a long time by the fire, their voices low. Abby, who was cleaning a rabbit, watched them. She saw the tension in Lone Hawk's shoulders, the way his body grew still. When the trader left, Lone Hawk stood for a long time, staring at the ground. "What is it?" Abby asked, approaching him. He looked up, and his eyes were dark with a cold fury she had not seen before. "They are coming," he said. "Who?" "The white men, with their chains and their sticks. The railroad men, the ones who bought you." The words stung, but she saw he was not angry at her. He was angry at the world that had enacted the bargain. "What are they doing?" she asked. The trader saw them. "Surveyors. They are mapping the valley of the sleeping fathers." "The sacred ground," she whispered, remembering what he had told her during the storm. "The place his ancestors were buried." "They will draw their lines over our bones," he said, his voice flat. "They will tear up the graves to make a road for their iron horse." He turned and walked away, needing to be alone. Abby watched him go, her heart aching for him, for the weariness in his frame. He wanted to fight, she knew. He was a warrior, but the dust storm had cost them dearly. They had so little left. The people were tired. They were hungry. They were in no condition for a war they could not win. The weeks that followed the storm changed the rhythm between them. The shared, desperate need for survival in the rock crevice had burned away the last of their awkwardness. He no longer slept by the fire. The nights were cold, and the rebuilt lodge was small. It was a practical decision. He took one side, she took the other. But the space between their sleeping furs was no longer a vast, empty prairie. It was just a few feet of packed earth. Abby became proactive. She was no longer a guest or a prisoner. This was her life. She began to truly work. She learned to use the short bow, her arm growing strong, her aim improving. She learned to find the edible plants, to set snares, to skin the game Lone Hawk brought back. She even began to cook. She missed the bread and salt of her old life. One day, using the trader's salt and a bag of flour she had insisted Lone Hawk trade for, she made a crude, flat bread over the fire. He returned from a hunt, tired and empty-handed. The game was scarce. He smelled the bread before he saw it. He stopped, surprised. She held a piece out to him. It was heavy and scorched, but it was bread. He took it. He bit into it. His eyes closed for a second. It was the taste of his enemy, the taste of the white world, but it was also warm and filling, and it was a gift. He ate the whole piece without a word, and she understood it as a thank you. She began to mix their worlds. She used the wild herbs the Comanche women taught her, but she added the salt and pepper she craved. She made stews from rabbit and root vegetables that tasted like both cultures, like neither, like something new. One evening, he returned late. He limped into the firelight, his left shoulder dark with blood. Hawk Abby cried, dropping the pot she was holding. "It is nothing," he gritted out, sitting heavily by the fire. "A bounty hunter. He thought my scalp was worth $10. He was wrong, Lone Hawk added, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "You are hurt," Abby said. She ran to the lodge and grabbed her sewing basket, which held the only medical supplies. She had a clean needle, thread, and a flask of whiskey her father had given her, which she had kept for emergencies. She also grabbed a strip of clean cloth. When she returned, he was still sitting there, his face pale under his tan. "Let me see," she said, her voice firm, the way she used to talk to Tommy when he fell. He hesitated. To show pain was weakness. "Do not be a fool," she said, her voice softening. "It will fester." He nodded, a sharp, pained movement. He slowly pulled his buckskin tunic over his head. Abby had seen him without a shirt, working in the heat, but this was different. He was vulnerable. His body was a map of old scars, pale lines on his copper skin. The new wound was a long, ugly gash along his collarbone, deep, but not fatal. "It needs cleaning," she said. Her voice did not tremble, though her hands wanted to. She knelt in front of him. The firelight flickered between them. She uncorked the whiskey. "This will hurt." "It is just firewater," he said, bracing himself. She poured the whiskey directly into the wound. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, and his entire body went rigid, but he made no other sound. "Hold still," she murmured. She threaded the needle. Her hands were close to his skin. She could feel the heat radiating from him. She could smell the sweat, and the blood, and the whiskey. She began to stitch. Her movements were quick, practiced from years of mending saddles and grain sacks. But this was skin, living skin. With each stitch, his muscles clenched. "I am sorry," she whispered. Her head bent to her work. "Do not be sorry," he said, his voice rough. "Just be done." She finished, tied off the thread, and cut it. Her face was very close to his. She could see the pulse beating in his throat, the fine lines of pain around his eyes. She took the clean cloth and gently began to dab away the excess blood. Her touch was soft. She was tending to him, not as a duty, but as a partner. He was watching her, his dark eyes intense. The pain had faded, replaced by a different kind of awareness. He had never been touched this way, not with such gentle care. Her hand, holding the cloth, rested on his chest, just below the wound. She looked up, and their eyes met. The space between them was electric. It was filled with the smoke of the fire, the smell of blood, and the unspoken words of the past weeks. The man who had given her a knife, the woman who had stayed, the storm they had survived, the bread she had baked, the wound she had just sewn. His hand came up, slowly, hesitantly. He did not touch her face or her hair. He laid his hand over hers, the one that rested on his chest. His skin was hot against hers. His thumb gently rubbed the back of her hand. It was a question. "Are you afraid?" he whispered. She looked at his hand on hers, then back to his eyes. She thought of the fear she had felt on her wedding night, the cold, abject terror. It was gone. She was not that girl anymore. "I stayed," she said, her voice just as quiet. "I stayed from the first night. If I wanted to go, I would have been gone a long time ago." It was all the answer he needed. He leaned forward, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not move. She did not breathe. His lips touched hers. It was not a kiss of passion, not the kind she had read about in her mother's hidden books. It was a kiss of profound, aching gentleness. It was slow and tentative and clumsy. It tasted of smoke and salt and a little of whiskey. It was a kiss of curiosity, of two worlds colliding not in violence, but in a moment of fragile peace. It was a question and an answer, all in one. He pulled back, just enough to see her face. Her eyes were closed. She opened them, a dazed, uncertain look in them. He did not smile, but the harsh lines around his mouth softened. He leaned in and rested his forehead against hers for a single, long breath. Then he sat back, letting his hand fall from hers. The moment was broken, but it hovered in the air between them. Abby tied the cloth as a bandage over the stitches, her hands trembling now that the task was done. "It is finished," she said, her voice a little breathless. "It is," he agreed. He stood, picked up his tunic, and slowly, carefully, pulled it back on. He walked to the lodge, pushed aside the flap, and went inside. Abby sat by the fire, her fingers tingling where he had touched her. She had just sewn a man's flesh and kissed him, all in the span of 10 minutes. She did not know what to feel. But as she watched the fire, a new, unwelcome sound drifted on the night air. It was the faint, rhythmic clang of metal on metal. It was far away, to the east. At the same time, in the main Comanche camp a mile down the creek, Crow Ghost was speaking. He had been using the railroad, the surveyors, as a tool to fan the flames of anger. "I saw them," he said to the other warriors, his voice full of rage. "They are measuring our father's graves. And what does Lone Hawk do? He stays in his lodge with his white woman. He eats her white bread." He had been meeting with Mercer in secret. The sheriff, who saw Crow Ghost's rage as a useful tool, had promised him rifles. He promised him whiskey. All he had to do was create enough trouble, enough violence, to justify the railroad bringing in soldiers. "Lone Hawk is a traitor." Crow Ghost spat. "He is one of them. He has betrayed us for a woman and a promise. It is time for true warriors to act." The faint sound of metal on metal grew louder. Abby looked up from the fire. Lone Hawk emerged from the lodge, his face grim. He had heard it too. He walked to her, and they stood side by side, listening. Then he pointed, not to the east, where the sound was, but to the south, to the valley. A new star had appeared on the horizon, near the mouth of the sacred valley. It was not a star, it was a fire, a campfire. "The surveyors," he said. Abby stood next to him, their shoulders almost touching. They watched the small, defiant light that signaled the end of their fragile peace. The sound of the railroad, and the sight of the fire, meant that the world was coming for them, and the time for slow, hesitant kisses was over. The fire in the sacred valley was the first shot. The railroad was not asking, it was taking. Within 3 days, Mr. Beckett's surveyors, protected by a dozen hired guns whose cartridge belts were heavy and whose eyes were cold, had established a main camp. They hammered wooden stakes into the ground, stringing lines across the valley floor. They planted a large, arrogant flag, not of the United States, but of the railroad company. It was a black and gold banner that whipped in the wind, a declaration that this land, these graves, now belonged to a ledger book back east. The news hit the Comanche camp like a physical blow. The elder, his face carved with grief, called an emergency council. They met in the open, under the harsh sun, because no lodge was big enough to hold the anger. The voices were immediate and divided. "We must move," a man named Broken Hand said, his voice heavy. He had seen too much. "They have the repeating rifles. They have the soldiers. If we stay, we are watering the graves with the blood of our children." A woman, whose son had been killed in the last raid, stood up. "Move where they push us from the plains. They push us from the rivers. Now they push us from our dead. There is no where left to go." Crow Ghost rose, his body trembling with a rage that was almost a sickness. "Move, I will move. I will move against their metal sticks. I will move against their scalps. This is the land of our fathers, and we will fight for it until the last of them is dead, or the last of us is—" He looked around, his eyes wild. "Or has the white woman made us all as soft as her husband?" All eyes turned to Lone Hawk. He sat, his arms resting on his knees, his face calm. The insult hung in the air, but he did not rise to it. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, not full of fire, but of a cold, weary weight. "My brother Crow Ghost speaks with a brave heart, and he is right. We must fight. But what is the weapon? His arrows against their cannons, my rifle against their company of soldiers. We have fought that war for 20 years. We have lost." "So we run?" Broken Hand asked. "No," Lone Hawk said, standing up. He was not a big man, but his presence filled the circle. "We do not run. We fight. But we use their weapon, their paper, their laws, their tricks." He looked at the elder. "They made this bargain. They made this marriage." He glanced at Abby, who was standing at the edge of the circle, watching, her heart hammering. "They made it as a symbol of peace. Now, we will use that symbol against them. Let me go to the town. Let me take my wife. We will stand before them and ask, 'Does your peace mean you must desecrate our graves?' We will show them their own trick, in the light of day." There was a long silence. The elder nodded, slowly. "It is a thin rope over a deep canyon, but it is the only one we have. Go, speak to this peace. See if their words have any meaning at all." Crow Ghost spat on the ground. "Words, while they steal our land. You are a fool. Lone Hawk, you are going to the man's house to beg, and you are taking his daughter to hold your hand." He stormed away, his followers with him. That night, Abby and Lone Hawk prepared. She put on the buckskin tunic. It was her skin now. "It is not your fight," he said, his voice quiet as he checked the thong on his knife. He would take no rifle. This was not an act of war. "They bought me to make this bargain," she said, her voice hard. "I am part of the price. Now they will have to look at what they paid for. I am going to see my father, Elias." He looked at her, surprised. "He is a weak man," Abby said, her voice cold with a knowledge that went deeper than his. "He is a coward, but he is my father, and he is the one who signed the paper. Mercer and Beckett rule him with fear. Maybe, just maybe, he will fear for his daughter more." He held her gaze, seeing the steel that had replaced the fear in her. He nodded. "We ride at dawn." They walked into San Miguel. They did not ride. They walked, leading a single horse. It was a deliberate act. They were not warriors. They were not conquerors. They were a man and a woman, coming to talk. The town, however, saw something else entirely. By the time they reached the main street, windows were opening and people were stepping out of the general store and the saloon to stare. Their whispers were as loud as the wind. "That is the Monroe girl." "God in heaven, look at her, dressed like one of them." "She has been with him all this time. 3, maybe 4 weeks. I heard they are savages, what he must have done to her. Look at her hair, braided. She has gone native." Abby felt the hot, sharp stabs of their judgment. This was her town. These were the people she had known her whole life. The woman at the mercantile, who had given her candy as a child. The blacksmith, who had let her watch him work. Now, they looked at her as if she were a sideshow curiosity, a piece of spoiled meat. Her first instinct was to shrink, to lower her head, to pull her hair over her face. She felt Lone Hawk's presence beside her. He walked with his head high, his gaze forward, ignoring the stares, the hate, the fear. He was a rock in the river, and the town's whispers were just water flowing around him. Abby took a deep breath. She straightened her back. She would not be a rock. She was fire. She had sown his skin. She had survived the storm. She was the wife of a Comanche warrior, and she was done being ashamed. She lifted her chin, and her eyes, cold and clear, swept the crowd. She dared them to meet her gaze, one by one. They looked away. As they walked, her hand, which had been clenched at her side, brushed against his. It was an accident. Then, it was not. Her fingers lightly, deliberately grazed the back of his hand. It was a small, almost invisible gesture, but to the town, it was a shout. It was a declaration. She was not his captive. She was his partner. Lone Hawk's hand turned, just slightly, and his fingers brushed hers in return. An answer. They reached the wreckage of the Monroe Ranch. It was even worse than she remembered. The fences were down. The porch was sagging. A foreclosure notice, signed by Sheriff Mercer, was nailed to the front door, dated 2 weeks prior. Pa Abby called out, pushing the door open. The smell hit her first. Stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, and despair. Elias Monroe was sitting at the kitchen table, a bottle in one hand, staring at a wall. He was thin, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. He looked like he had aged 10 years. Pa Abby said again, her voice softer. Elias turned. Slowly. His eyes tried to focus. Abby, he whispered. He thought he was seeing a ghost, a drunken hallucination. Abby, girl, is that you? It is me, Pa. He stumbled to his feet, his chair scraping the floor. He rushed to her, his arms open, and for a second, she was his daughter again. He crushed her to him, his body shaking. They said you were gone. He sobbed into her hair. They said you were with him. He pulled back, and his eyes finally registered Lone Hawk, who was standing in the doorway, silent, his presence filling the small, broken room. Elias's relief vanished, replaced by the familiar mask of fear. He backed away from Abby, wiping his face. What is he doing here? What do you want? I have nothing left. I came to ask you to tell the truth. Pa, Abby said, her voice steady. The truth, he laughed, a short, ugly sound. The truth is we are ruined. The truth is that you were forced into this, Abby said, stepping toward him. The truth is that Mercer and Beckett threatened you. They threatened Tommy. They used me to get this land. And now they are using me to steal land from his people. Elias would not meet her eyes. He looked at Lone Hawk. He is a savage. This is what they do. They take... He has taken nothing, Abby said, her voice ringing with a fierce, sudden clarity. He gave me shelter. He gave me respect. He has never, not once, laid a hand on me in anger. He is more of a man than anyone in this town. Abby, stop, Elias pleaded, holding his head. You do not know what you are saying. They will hear you. I want them to hear me, Abby said, and I want them to hear you. They are at the valley. Pa, the sacred valley. They are staking it out. Lone Hawk came to ask for peace, to honor the agreement they forced on us. Peace agreement. Elias looked terrified. There is no agreement. There is only what they want. They own me. They own this land. They own you. They do not own me, Abby said, and they do not own you, not unless you let them. Pa, I am asking you, for once in your life, stand up for me, stand up for Tommy. Tell them what they did. Tell them the marriage was a lie, a threat. You are the only one who can... Elia looked at his daughter, at the strong, strange woman she had become. He saw the hope in her eyes, the desperate plea, and he was so afraid. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The sound of boots on the porch made them all freeze. The door swung open, and Sheriff Clay Mercer filled the space, his hand on his pistol. Behind him, smiling his thin, cold smile, was Mr. Beckett. "Well, well," Mercer said, his eyes a cold blue. "Look what the cat dragged in, the happy couple." Beckett stepped into the room, his gaze sweeping over the filth, over Elias and settling on Abby, Miss Monroe, or should I say, Mrs. Lone Hawk. "You are looking rustic. We were so worried about you." "Get out of my house," Elias stammered, trying to find some remnant of his authority. "This is not your house." "Elias," Mercer said, stepping in, "this is the property of the San Miguel Holding Company, pending your final eviction. And you," he said, turning to Lone Hawk, "you have no business here. Get off this property. Savages are not permitted in town limits after dark, and you are pushing the daylight." "We came to talk," Lone Hawk said, his voice even. "Your men are in our valley, our sacred land. We have an agreement, a marriage of peace." Beckett laughed. It was a dry, scraping sound. "An agreement. You have an agreement. You are a Comanche. You have no rights. You have no land, except the patch we decide to let you starve on. The marriage was a formality, a gesture of our goodwill, which you seem to be spitting on." "You are breaking your word," Lone Hawk said. "He has no rights here." "Sheriff," Beckett said, turning to Mercer, as if Lone Hawk were a piece of furniture, "remove him." Mercer stepped toward Lone Hawk, his hand dropping to his billy club. "You heard the man. Time to go." "No," Abby cried, moving to stand between them. "You cannot do this. This is a lie, Pa. Tell them the truth." All eyes went to Elias. He was shaking, his face a sickly gray. He looked at Mercer's gun, at Beckett's cold smile, and at Abby's desperate face. "Elias," Mercer said, his voice a soft, dangerous purr. "You have a choice. Right now. You can side with this thing. You can lose everything, your land, for good. Your boy. I am sure we can find a reason to have him sent to the state reformatory. Or you can tell your daughter to be quiet, and we can forget this whole unfortunate visit." Elias looked at Abby. His lips moved. He was drowning, and he was pulling her under with him. "And as for you, girl," Mercer said, his gaze slimy, raking over Abby's buckskin tunic, "I cannot believe you're shaming your father like this. Running off with him. You are just cheap white goods, sold to a savage for a handful of dirt. You are ruined." It happened fast. Lone Hawk did not shout. He did not issue a challenge. He simply moved. One moment he was by the door. The next he was crossing the room, his body a blur of contained, lethal rage. His hand flashed to his knife, and his other hand shot out, grabbing Mercer by the throat, slamming him back against the wall. The knife was at the sheriff's chin, a single drop of blood welling up. "Do not," Lone Hawk whispered, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "Speak her name again." Beckett scrambled back, fumbling for his own small pistol. Mercer choked, his eyes bulging. "Hawk, no," Abby screamed. She grabbed his arm, the one holding the knife. She put her whole body into it, pulling him back. "No," she said, her voice desperate. "This is what they want, look. This is what they want. They want you to be the savage. They want to kill you and say it was justice. Do not give it to them." He was trembling with the force of his rage. His eyes locked on Mercer. He was a warrior, and his wife had been insulted, his honor challenged. "Please," Abby whispered, her hands clinging to his arm. "For me, this is not the way." For a long, agonizing second, he remained frozen. The only sound was Mercer's gagging. Then, slowly, the tension went out of his shoulders. He looked at Abby. He saw her face, pale but fierce, and he saw the truth in her words. He released his grip. Mercer slumped to the floor, gasping, his hand at his throat. Lone Hawk did not sheath his knife. He just held it and stepped back to Abby's side. Mr. Beckett, now that the danger was past, found his courage. You see, he shrieked, his voice high. "He is a savage. He attacked the sheriff. Arrest him! Arrest him!" Mercer got to his feet, his face purple. He drew his pistol and pointed it at Lone Hawk. "This is it, boy," he snarled. "You are done." Pa Abby screamed, turning to her father. "Pa, for God's sake, say something. Tell them what really happened. Tell them what Mercer said." It was the last chance, the single moment. Elias Monroe stood between the sheriff's gun and his daughter's plea. His life, his soul, hung in the balance. He looked at the gun. He looked at Mercer's face, which promised a long, painful future of legal trouble, prison, and the loss of his son. He broke. I do not know," Elias Monroe stammered, his eyes on the floor. "I do not know what happened. He just attacked. It all happened so fast." He looked up, his eyes pleading. "Not with Abby, but with Mercer. Please, Sheriff, I do not want any trouble. I just want it to be over." The words hit Abby like a physical blow. It was not a betrayal. It was an annihilation. He had not just failed to save her. He had actively buried her. He had chosen the liars. He had chosen his own miserable safety over her life. She looked at her father, this strange, pathetic man. The last ember of hope, the last shred of daughterly love, went cold. He was gone. She turned away from him, her face a mask of stone. She looked at Mercer's gun, and then at Lone Hawk. "He is right," she said, her voice dead, empty. "I have no home here." She turned, and without looking back at her father, or the sheriff, or the man who had bought her, she walked out of the cabin and into the harsh, unforgiving sunlight. Lone Hawk, his knife still in his hand, his eyes never leaving Mercer's, backed slowly out after her. The ride back from the Monroe Ranch was a journey through a dead, silent land. Abby and Lone Hawk moved in a cloud of shared defeat. The confrontation had been a disaster, ending not with a bang, but with the whimpering, pathetic betrayal of a weak man. Abby felt hollowed out, scoured clean of any hope she had harbored for her old life. She had no home. The word, which had once meant a sagging porch and the smell of baking bread, was now just a sound. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that while they were facing down Mercer and Elias in that squalid kitchen, Crow Ghost was making his own move. He was not a man of words or of waiting. He was a man of fire. He had gathered 6 young warriors, boys whose blood was hot and who were sick of the elders' cautious talk. He had told them that Lone Hawk was a traitor, that the white woman had softened his mind, and that the only way to prove their strength was to strike. They descended upon the surveyor's camp in the Sacred Valley at high noon. It was not a battle. It was a brutal, chaotic raid. They came in screaming, their faces painted, and the surveyors, who were men of chains and numbers, not guns, scattered. The hired guards, caught by surprise, were overwhelmed. Crow Ghost's warriors set fire to the tents, smashed the strange, delicate measuring instruments, and drove off the supply mules. 2 of the guards, men who had been too slow to drop their tools and grab their rifles, were killed, left where they fell. A stark message to the railroad. Crow Ghost had struck his blow for the honor of his ancestors. He had, in his mind, acted as a true warrior. The terrified, breathless survivors stumbled back into San Miguel 2 hours later. Bringing the news, Sheriff Clay Mercer listened, his face a perfect mask of grave, official concern. Mr. Beckett, standing beside him, had to fight to keep the triumphant smile from his thin lips. "An unprovoked attack," Mercer declared, his voice booming for the benefit of the rapidly gathering crowd in the saloon. "A savage, unprovoked massacre. They have broken the peace." "What are you going to do, Sheriff?" a man called out. "I am going to do my job," Mercer said. He strode to the telegraph office, Beckett at his heels. This was not a setback. This was a gift. The railroad's charter allowed for military protection in the case of hostile action. Crow Ghost had just handed them the justification they needed. Mercer tapped out the message himself, not to his superiors, but to the Army detachment at Fort Griffin. Hostile Comanche uprising in San Miguel Territory. Surveyors for the Transcontinental Railroad attacked. Property destroyed. 2 men killed. Requesting immediate military assistance to protect federal interests and civilian lives. He was not calling for an investigation. He was not asking for a peace talk. He was calling for a punishment. He was calling for a war. And he knew, with perfect certainty, exactly who to blame and where to direct the soldiers. Abby and Lone Hawk were halfway back to their camp when the weight of their failure finally settled. They had failed. The peace gesture was a joke, and her father's betrayal had sealed it. "We need supplies," Abby said, her voice flat, dead. There is a man at the saloon, Sam, the bartender. He is a good man. He might know what Mercer is planning to do now." Lone Hawk looked at the town, his face grim. "The town is poisoned now. My face will get us killed." "You wait here," Abby said. "By the creek. I will go. I am still, in their eyes, a white woman. They will just look at me with pity, not with a gun." She slipped through the alleyways, her buckskin blending into the shadows. The saloon was buzzing, not with its usual drunken revelry, but with a new, panicked energy. She went to the back door, the one used for deliveries and trash. Sam, the bartender, was a thin man with a perpetually worried expression. He was tossing out a bucket of dirty water when he saw her. "Abby," he hissed, grabbing her arm and pulling her into the sudden darkness of the storage room. "Good God, girl. What are you doing here? You have to get out. You and your husband." "What is it?" Abby asked, her heart seizing. "What happened?" "While you were gone, while everyone was at your paws, I reckon Crow Ghost. He raided the surveyors, killed 2 men. They just brought the bodies in." Abby felt the floor drop out from under her. "No, oh God, no." "It is bad, Abby," Sam said, his voice low and urgent, wiping his hands on his apron. "It is exactly the excuse Mercer wanted. He is in the telegraph office right now. He is calling in the army. He is telling them it is a full-blown uprising. He is going to wipe out the whole tribe. Abby, he is going to send the soldiers straight to that valley." Abby leaned against the wall, the smell of stale beer and sawdust filling her lungs. It was a trap, a perfect, brutal trap. Mercer, she realized, must have known Crow Ghost would act. He might have even encouraged it. He had used Crow Ghost's rage, and now he was going to use the army's guns. And the price, the terrible, bloody price, would be paid by Lone Hawk's people, by the children, by the women, by the old elder. "Thank you, Sam," she whispered. She slipped back out the door, her legs shaking. She ran, her feet flying over the hard-packed earth, back to the creek where Lone Hawk waited. She told him, the words spilling out in a torrent of fear and dawning horror. He did not waste a moment on, "I told you so." His face became a mask of cold stone. He grabbed her hand, and they ran to their horse. He swung up, pulled her up behind him, and they rode. Not at a walk, but at a hard, frantic gallop. When they arrived at the main Comanche camp, it was already in chaos. But it was not the chaos of fear. It was the chaos of celebration. Crow Ghost was the center of it all. He was strutting, holding aloft a surveyor's long, wooden measuring stick like a trophy. The young warriors were chanting, their blood high. They were heroes. They had struck a blow. Then they saw Lone Hawk, his horse lathered, and Abby clinging to his back. The chanting died. "The white man's dog returns," Crow Ghost shouted, his voice ringing with triumph. He strode forward, his chest puffed out. "You fool!" Lone Hawk roared. Dismounting before the horse had even stopped, he strode toward Crow Ghost, his rage a physical, shimmering force. "You have doomed us. You have killed us all." The camp went silent. "What are you talking about?" Crow Ghost sneered. I have done what a warrior does. While you were in the White Town, holding your woman's hand, I was fighting for our ancestors." "You did exactly what they wanted," Lone Hawk shouted, his voice cracking with the terrible force of the truth. "Mercer is calling in the soldiers. He is calling in the army. He wanted this. He wanted a reason to kill us. And you gave it to him." The color drained from Crow Ghost's face. The cheering of the young warriors died. The elder stepped forward, his face a mask of sudden, terrible understanding. Crow Ghost, caught, his heroism turning to ash, did the only thing he could. He turned the blame. He pointed a shaking finger, not at Lone Hawk, but at Abby. "No!" he screamed. "It is a lie. He lies. How does he know this? He knows it because she told him. How did the soldiers know we were attacking? How will they know where to find us?" He stalked toward Abby, who stood frozen by the horse. "She is the spy. She was in the town. She told her father. She told her sheriff she came here, to our lodges. A snake in our blankets. She brought this curse." "That is not true," Abby cried, her voice thin. "She is a white woman," Crow Ghost roared, turning to the terrified, confused crowd. "Her people are the ones coming. She is one of them. She is the reason. She is the one who has brought this doom upon us." A murmur went through the crowd. It was a low, ugly sound. They were afraid. The army was coming. They had seen the army before. They knew what it meant: fire and death and the end of all things. They needed a reason. They needed someone to blame. And there she stood, the outsider, the pale-skinned, blue-eyed cause of all their trouble. Several warriors started to move toward her, their faces dark with fear and rage. Lone Hawk moved. He put himself directly in front of Abby, his arms spread wide. "No," he said. His voice was not a shout. It was a command, and it stopped them. He stood in the middle of the circle, trapped. He looked at the faces of his people, the people he was trying to save, and he saw them turning on his wife. He looked at Crow Ghost, who was watching with a look of murderous triumph. He was caught. If he defended Abby, he was proving Crow Ghost's point. He was a traitor, a man who chose a white woman over his own kin. If he stepped aside, if he said nothing, he would be betraying the woman he had stitched, the woman he had kissed, the woman he had sworn, in his own heart, to protect. He would be committing the one sin he could not live with. He made his choice. He raised his hands, and slowly, deliberately, he turned to the elder. He spoke, his voice clear, ringing across the silent camp, in the Comanche tongue, a language Abby still only half understood. "Our brother Crow Ghost is right," he said. The camp gasped. Abby's heart stopped. "The white man's law is what brought this," Lone Hawk continued, his voice steady. "They have broken their word, but I am the one who accepted it. I am the one who made the bargain." He turned, not to look at Abby, but to face the entire tribe. "She is guilty of nothing. She did not ask to come here. I am the one who accepted her. I am the one who brought her to our lodges. I am the one who took the white man's paper." He took a deep breath, and his gaze locked with the elders. "If a price must be paid, it is my price. If the white man's army comes, the fault is mine. If the spirits are angry, it is because of me. If anyone must be held to account, I will be the one. If you must cast someone out to save the people, cast me out." Abby did not understand all the words, but she understood the gestures. She understood the finality in his tone. She understood him pointing to himself. She understood the word for banish. He was offering to leave. He was offering to be in exile, to save his people from the consequences of his actions. He was choosing them. He was choosing his duty. He was cutting her, and the problem she represented, loose. He was a man of honor, and he was fulfilling his obligation. But he was not doing it for her. He was doing it because of her. Crow Ghost, however, saw only weakness. He saw a man willing to throw away his life for a woman who was not worth it. He laughed, a short, ugly, barking sound. "Banish you," he sneered, stepping forward. "You are already banished. You banished yourself when you took her." He turned on Lone Hawk, his voice rising, full of venom, for all the camp to hear. "Do you think this is honor? This is just more of the white man's trick. You only married her because they played you. They looked at you, the poor Comanche, the warrior with no horses, and they pitied you. They gave you their cast-off, worthless daughter as an act of pity." He spun and pointed at Abby, his fingers stabbing the air. "And you pity her, look at her, she is nothing, sold by her father for a bottle of whiskey. You do not love her, you just pity her. This is not a marriage, this is not a man. This is just two broken, pathetic things, pitying each other in a cold lodge." The word, pity. The word struck Abby with the force of a physical blow. It was the one word in the entire world that could have broken her. Pity. She remembered the way the women in San Miguel had looked at her. Poor Abby Monroe. She remembered her father's face as he sold her. To save Tommy. A transaction. She remembered the sneer in Mercer's voice. Cheap white goods. And now, this. She looked at Lone Hawk. He was standing, his face a mask of stone, his gaze locked on Crow Ghost, his mind clearly racing, trying to find a way to counter this new political attack. He did not look at her. He did not deny it. And his silence was a confession. It all made a terrible, horrifying sense. Of course, it was not love. It was not even desire. It was pity. He had not touched her on their wedding night. He had given her the knife and the bridle because he pitied the terrified girl he had been forced to take. He had protected her from Crow Ghost because he pitied her. He had huddled with her in the storm, sewn her stitches. Even that fumbling, gentle kiss, it was all pity. A moment of kindness for the broken, pathetic thing he had been saddled with. She was not his partner. She was his burden. She was the white woman, the spy, the curse that was destroying his life. He had just offered to be banished, not to save her, but to save himself from the shame of it all. The shame was suffocating. She could not breathe. She was a political tool, a pawn, a weight, a mistake. And now, her presence was going to get all these people, these children, these women, killed by an army. She looked at Lone Hawk's face, still locked in his silent, angry battle with Crow Ghost. She had to undo it. She had to fix the one thing she could. She could not stop the army, but she could remove the burden. She could remove the spy. She could free him from the awful, crushing weight of pitying her. No one was watching her. They were all transfixed by the two warriors. She was invisible, a ghost, just a word they were fighting over. She turned. Slowly, she walked, her feet numb, out of the circle. No one stopped her. She did not run. She walked with a terrible, calm resolve. She walked back to the small, rebuilt lodge they had shared. Night fell. The argument in the main camp was still raging, a low, angry murmur across the prairie. She entered the lodge. It was dark. She packed nothing. She owned nothing. But her eyes fell on the objects from her first night, the bridle and the knife, the tools of his pity. She picked them up. "Take my fastest horse, the gray one. I will say you are dead." His voice from that first night, it had not been an offer of freedom. It had been an offer of disposal. She went to the horses, her movements fluid, certain, the gray mare, his fastest, his most prized possession. She bridled the horse, her hands sure in the darkness. She slipped the knife into the waistband of her tunic. She swung herself into the saddle. She looked, once, back at the main camp, a cluster of firelight and angry shadows. She was doing the only thing she could. She was solving his problem. She was removing the white woman. She was giving him his life back. She was freeing him. She turned the horse south, not toward San Miguel, not toward her father, but away, into the dark, empty canyons. She rode, not as a runaway, but as a sacrifice, with the word pity echoing in her ears like the beat of the horse's hooves. In San Miguel, Sheriff Clay Mercer was reviewing the reports for his request to the Army. He needed more. He needed a smoking gun. And the attack on the surveyors was not quite enough. It was an act of savagery. Yes, but he wanted an act of bad faith. He needed to prove the Comanche could not be trusted in any treaty. A scout, a man who earned his pay by riding the borderlands, kicked open the door to the office. "Sheriff," the man panted, his clothes spattered with mud from a hard ride. "I just saw something you will want to know." "What is it, Hank?" Mercer asked, annoyed. "It is the Monroe girl, the one who went with the Comanche. She is out there, riding south, alone." Mercer's head snapped up. Beckett, who had been reading the telegraph drafts, looked over, his eyes gleaming. "Alone," Mercer said, standing, "as the day she was born, on a fine gray mare, riding hard for the canyons. Looked like she was running." Mercer and Beckett exchanged a look. It was a look of pure, predatory understanding. This was not a complication. This was an opportunity. "She ran away," Beckett said, his mind working fast. "He abused her. The savage finally showed his colors. She has fled for her life." "That is the story we will tell," Mercer said, a grin spreading across his face. "But more than that, she is a hostage." "A hostage?" Beckett asked. "If she is running from him, he will want her back, if only for his pride. If she is running with him, even better. We rescue her. We hold her. We send word to Lone Hawk the girl stays with us, safe and sound, until he and his people sign the treaty giving up the valley. We will be heroes, rescuing a white woman." "It is brilliant," Beckett said. "Get your men! Hank!" Mercer commanded. "A full posse. 10, maybe 15 men. I want her found. I want her taken. And I want her unharmed. She is no good to us damaged." The argument in the Comanche camp had fractured, not ended. Lone Hawk had finally silenced Crow Ghost with a look of such cold, lethal promise that even the hot-headed warrior had stepped back. The council had broken apart, the people scattering to their lodges, terrified of the army. And now, divided among themselves, Lone Hawk stalked back to his lodge, his mind a storm of strategy and rage. He had to counter Crow Ghost's lie. He had to find a way to protect his people. He had to... He pushed aside the hide flap. "Abby," he began. The lodge was empty. A cold, sick feeling, a feeling worse than any fear of battle, settled in his stomach. He saw the space where her furs had been. It was empty. He ran to the small overhang where he kept his tack. The bridle, the one he had placed on the floor that first night, was gone. He went to the horses, his gray mare, his fastest, his best. The horse he treasured was gone. He stood for a long moment, the world narrowing to this single, terrible fact. She was gone. But this was not the first night. She had not left because he offered. She had left because of Crow Ghost. She had left because of that single, poisoned word. Pity. He understood. He saw it all. In one devastating, clear-as-day flash. She had not left him. She had fled the word. She had fled the shame. She had fled, believing she was a burden, a thing of pity, and that her absence would save him. And he had let her. He had been so locked in his own pride, his own political battle with Crow Ghost, that he had not looked at her. He had not seen the mortal wound that word had dealt her. He ran back to his remaining horse, a strong bay gelding. He grabbed his bow, his quiver, and a long coil of rope. "Where are you going?" the elder asked, appearing at his side. "The army is not the only threat," Lone Hawk said, his voice raw. "She is gone." "Let her go, my son," the elder said, his voice full of sorrow. "She is the white world. She brings us nothing but pain." "She is my wife," Lone Hawk said, the words tasting strange and true. He swung onto the horse's back. "And she is lost." He did not wait for an answer. He rode, not toward San Miguel, but south, toward the canyons, his eyes on the ground, reading the story of the gray mare's flight. He rode with a new kind of fear in his heart, not for his people, not for his land, but for a girl with blue eyes who thought she was worthless. Abby pushed the gray mare hard. She rode south, into the labyrinth of red rock canyons. She had no destination. She only knew she had to get away, to disappear, so that the word spy and the word pity could no longer be attached to Lone Hawk's name. She was erasing herself from his life. The sky, which had been a clear, high blue, was beginning to curdle. Thick, bruised-looking clouds were rolling in from the west. The air was heavy, the wind picking up, whistling through the rock formations. She did not notice. She was numb, riding on a wave of pure, agonizing shame. She was deep in a narrow box canyon when she heard the shouts. There she is. That is the horse. Her head snapped up. On the rim of the canyon, silhouetted against the darkening sky, were at least a dozen riders. They were white men. They wore the hats of townsmen and the gun belts of hired guns. I cut her off. Do not let her get out. A cold, sharp terror, different from the shame, seized her. This was Mercer's posse. She yanked the mare's head, turning her, trying to ride back the way she came. But 4 more riders were already blocking the mouth of the canyon. She was trapped. "Give it up, Miss Monroe," a man shouted. "We are here to save you." A rifle shot cracked, the bullet whining off the rock far above her head. It was a warning shot. But the gray mare was a warrior's horse, not used to gunfire. The explosion so close to the canyon walls made the animal scream. It reared, its eyes white. "Whoa, whoa, easy," Abby cried, fighting for control. The horse, in its panic, scrambled sideways, its iron-shod hooves slipping on the slick rock. It lost its footing. The world tilted. Abby felt herself falling, and she let go of the reins, tucking her body as she had been taught. She landed hard on a wide, sloping ledge, sliding on gravel and grit. The air knocked from her lungs. The mare tumbled past her, down the rest of the steep embankment, landing with a sickening wet crack in the shallow, muddy streambed below. The horse did not get up. It lay still, its neck at a terrible angle. Abby gasped, the pain in her ribs sharp. She was on a ledge, perhaps 10 feet above the streambed. The ledge was wide, but the rock face above her was sheer. She could not climb up, and the drop to the stream was too far to jump. She was trapped. "She is down there," she heard the men shout. "The horse is dead. Go get her." A few of the men dismounted, starting to pick their way down the treacherous slope. And then, the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Lone Hawk had been following her tracks, his heart a cold knot of dread. He had seen the posse's tracks too, and he knew they were not a rescue party. They were a hunting party. He saw the darkening sky. He smelled the rain on the wind. He knew these canyons. He knew what a storm meant. A hard rain, even miles away, would send a wall of water, a flash flood, roaring through this narrow space. He pushed his horse harder, the bay's lungs burning. He rounded a bend and saw them, the posse, on the rim and in the canyon, like vultures. And he saw her. She was a small, bright patch of buckskin on a ledge, her hair plastered to her face, staring up at the men who were slowly, methodically, climbing down toward her, their rifles ready. He did not have time to choose. He did not have time for a plan. There was only Abby, and the men, and the coming water. He unslung his bow. He nocked an arrow. He was a warrior. "Hey, look!" one of the men on the rim shouted, pointing. "It is him. It is the Indian." Lone Hawk did not wait. He let his horse gallop, and as he rode, he slipped down, hanging off the side of the bay, Comanche style, a moving target, shielded by the animal's body. An arrow thwipped from beneath the horse's neck. The man who had shouted clutched his throat, a look of surprise on his face, and toppled from his horse. Chaos. "He is shooting, get him!" Rifles cracked, the bullets thudding into the body of the running horse or whining off the rocks. Lone Hawk wheeled the horse. Still hidden, he fired again. Another man, one who was halfway down the slope to Abby, cried out and slid down the embankment, clutching his leg. "Shoot the horse! Shoot the horse!" Mercer's voice, bellowing from somewhere. Lone Hawk was already changing tactics. He pulled his horse to a skidding stop behind a large boulder. He slid off its back, grabbing his rope. The men on the rim, their attention now on him, were firing, their bullets chipping stone from his cover. The rain was no longer dropping. It was a sheet, a downpour, cold and violent. The shallow stream in the canyon bed was already changing, the color turning from brown to a thick, churning red, the water rising visibly. "To hell with this!" one of the men shouted, looking at the sky, and then at the rising water. "This whole place is going to flood." The men on the slope, seeing their partners hit and hearing the growing roar of the water, scrambled back up. They were hired guns, not soldiers. They were not paid enough to die in a flood. "Get back here, you cowards," Mercer roared. But they were already running, mounting their horses, and riding for high ground. Lone Hawk used the retreat. He broke cover, not toward the men, but toward the ledge. He scrambled down the embankment, sliding, running, his eyes locked on Abby. She was still on the ledge, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. "Hawk!" she cried. He reached the edge of the embankment, just across from her. The stream was now a torrent, 5 feet deep and rising, carrying debris and the body of his dead mare. The rain hammered down. The roar of the water was deafening. "Abby, you have to jump," he shouted. "I cannot. It is too far." The ledge she was on was already slick. She tried to move, and her foot slipped. She screamed as she slid, her hands grasping at the slick rock. She fell, plunging into the red, churning water. No. Lone Hawk did not think. He took the coiled rope and dove in after her. The water was icy, a physical, battering force. He surfaced, spitting, and saw her. She was being swept away, her arms flailing. He was a strong swimmer. He dove through the current, his strokes powerful, and grabbed a handful of her buckskin tunic. He got his arm around her waist, holding her head above the water. "Hold on to me," he roared. They were being battered, slammed against the canyon walls, and dragged under. They were just 2 small things in a force of nature that wanted to erase everything. He saw it, a dark patch on the canyon wall, a small alcove, a hollow in the rock, just above the waterline. "There," he gasped. He used his legs, pushing off a submerged rock, fighting the current, and with a final, desperate surge, he threw her, and then himself, into the shallow cave. They collapsed, a heap of tangled limbs, gasping, coughing, spitting up muddy water. They were alive. The alcove was small, barely a hollow. It was cold and dark, and the sound of the flash flood outside was a terrifying, constant, deafening roar. They were soaked to the bone, the icy water sucking all the warmth from their bodies. Abby was shaking, her teeth chattering so hard she could not speak. Her leg was bleeding, a long gash from a rock. "You are hurt," he said, his own voice shaking, not from fear, but from the bone-chilling cold. I, she could not form words. "We will die," he said, his voice flat, stating a fact. "The cold. We will die before the water goes down." He looked at her blue lips, at the violent, uncontrollable shaking. He knew what he had to do. "We must get warm, now," he commanded. He began to rip at his own wet tunic, his fingers numb. "Take them off." "What?" she gasped, horrified. "Your clothes," he said, his voice harsh, urgent. "They are wet. They will kill you. Take them off, now. It is the only way. Skin. We need skin." He did not wait. He pulled his own tunic over his head. He helped her, his fingers fumbling with the wet laces of her tunic. He was not gentle. He was desperate. He pulled the wet, freezing buckskin from her, and his own leggings, until they were both stripped down, their bodies pale and shaking in the dim light. He grabbed the one dry thing he had, the buffalo robe, still in a tight, oilskin-wrapped bundle on his back. He ripped it open and threw the thick, dry fur around them. He pulled her against him, her back to his chest, his legs wrapping around hers, his arms crushing her to him. He pulled the heavy robe over both of them, creating a small, dark, shared space. Her skin was like ice. His was no better. "Stop shaking," he ordered. "Be still. We must be still." She was sobbing, a high, thin sound, half terror, half cold. "I am sorry," she chattered, her body convulsing. "The horse, your beautiful horse." "It was just a horse," he said, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "Be quiet. Breathe." He held her, tightly. It was not a lover's embrace. It was the desperate, animal grip of two creatures trying to survive. Her wet hair was in his face. Her skin, so cold, was pressed against his. He could feel the fine, sharp bones of her spine, the frantic hammering of her heart against his ribs. They stayed that way for a long time. The roaring of the water was their only world. Slowly, agonizingly, the shaking began to subside. The tiny, shared pocket of air under the robe began to warm. It was no longer 2 blocks of ice. It was just cold skin. "Hawk," she whispered, her voice a small, broken thing in the darkness. "I am here." "He said, Crow Ghost, he said you pitied me." He went still. He had been so focused on survival. He had forgotten the wound that drove her out. "Yes," he said. "He said you did not love me. You just felt sorry for me." He held her, his grip tightening. He rested his chin on the top of her wet hair. "Crow Ghost is a fool," he said, his voice low, but fierce. "He sees what he wants to see. I did not pity you, not in the way he means." What do you mean?" she whispered, afraid to hear the answer. He took a deep breath. The words were hard for him. They were words he had never spoken. "On the first night," he said, his voice a vibration against her back. "I gave you the knife, and the bridle. I did pity you. I pitied you because you were young and terrified, and you had been sold by your father. I gave you the choice because it was the only thing I could do that did not make me like the men who hunt me." She was silent, her heart breaking all over again. "But you stayed," he whispered. "I did not understand. You stayed, and I watched you. I watched you with the children. I watched you in the storm. I watched you sew my skin." He pulled her tighter, turning her slightly so he could speak to her, his breath warm on her cheek. "I do not know your word," he said. "For love, it is a white man's word, for songs and books. But I know this. Before you came, I was a ghost. I was a warrior, with nothing to fight for. I was just waiting to die, waiting for the last battle." He put his hand on her cold cheek, his rough fingers gentle. "And then you were there, and you were not a ghost. You were fire, and you were stubborn, and you were brave. And I stitched your wound, and you kissed me. And in that moment I was not a warrior. I was not a Comanche. I was just a man. And I did not want to die. For the first time, in 10 years I wanted to live." He let out a shaky breath. "I do not pity you, Abby. I see you. You are the only person who is not a ghost. That is not pity. I do not know what it is, but it is not pity." He had said it. He had spoken the deepest truth in his heart. She was quiet for so long he thought the cold had taken her, but she was not quiet. She was crying, a slow, hot, silent river of tears, washing away the shame, the fear, the pain of a lifetime. "I thought," she whispered, her voice thick, "I thought I was just a thing to be sold, a thing to be used, a thing to be pitied. My father, Mercer, even you, I thought I was just a burden, a curse, the white woman who brought the army. She turned in his arms, her face pressing into the hollow of his shoulder. Her skin was still cold, but it was alive. And all I ever wanted, she sobbed, was to be free. And that word pity, it was the last chain. It was the one that broke me. I thought if I ran, I could free you from it. I could free you from me. You free me, he said, his voice rough. By being here. You free me by breathing. Do not run from me again, ever. I will not, she whispered. He held her, and they were no longer two worlds, but one. Two broken, desperate people, clinging to each other in the dark, having finally, after all the battles and all the lies, spoken the truth. The roar of the water outside began to lessen as the first gray, watery light of dawn filtered into the alcove. The flood had receded. The canyon was still a raging river, but the water level had dropped. They were both alive. They were stiff and cold and bruised, but they were alive. They climbed out of the alcove, pulling on their still damp, muddy clothes. They stood on a high ledge, looking down at the canyon. The world was washed clean. The bodies of the men, the horses, the tracks, all of it was gone, erased by the flood. They stood side by side, his arm still loosely around her waist, not for warmth, but just to hold her. If we had not talked, she said, her voice hoarse, we could have died in there, and we would have died as strangers. We did not, he said. He looked at her, his eyes clear in the morning light. And we are not. The walk back was slow, a long journey of bruised limbs and shared exhaustion. They had lost the horse, the saddle, and every weapon save for Lone Hawk's knife. But they were alive. And for the first time, they were not two separate people. The canyon flood had washed away more than just tracks. It had washed away the lies, the shame, and the pity. When they reached the low bluffs overlooking the Comanche camp, they saw the smoke, not the small, scattered smoke of cook fires, but the thick, oily plume of a large, purposeful blaze. He is here, Lone Hawk said, his voice flat. They moved closer, using the rocks for cover. It was not the army. Not yet. It was Sheriff Clay Mercer, and about 20 men. They were not attacking the camp, which seemed to be mostly deserted. They were at the edge of the sacred valley, systematically burning the burial scaffolds. It was a desecration, a deliberate, calculated act of terror. A short distance away, Mr. Beckett was meeting with a group of important-looking men in suits, men who had clearly just arrived on a train. They were pointing at the map, and then at the smoke, their faces grave. Mercer was putting on a show. This, gentlemen, is what we are dealing with, Mercer said, his voice carrying on the wind. We tried to be peaceful. We even brokered a marriage, but they are violent. They attacked our surveyors, and now we have to restore order. This is a punitive action, sanctioned by the railroad, to protect our investment. Abby watched, her stomach churning. He is not waiting for the army, she whispered. He is using his own men and the railroad agents to make it look official. He is provoking a fight. Where is everyone? They have fled, Lone Hawk said, his eyes on the smoke, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. The elder has taken them into the hills, to hide, all except... He turned his head. On a ridge to the north, a small group of riders sat on their horses, watching. Crow Ghost and his warriors. They were watching their ancestors' graves burn, and they were preparing for a final, suicidal battle. He is going to get them all killed, Lone Hawk said. Mercer burns the graves. Crow Ghost attacks. The railroad men see it, and they will call in the entire army. It will be a massacre. Abby looked at the men in the suits, at Mercer's smug, righteous expression, and at the burning scaffolds. The truth, the real, complicated, painful truth. was being buried under smoke and lies. "No," she said. He looked at her. "No." "No," she said, her voice shaking, but not with fear, with rage. "I am done running. I am done being a ghost, and I am done being a victim." "You told the truth in that cave. Now they are going to hear it in the light." "Abby, they are armed," he said. "So am I," she said. She was not talking about a weapon. She was talking about her story. "They think I am a runaway. They think I am a hostage. They think I am a poor, pitied, savage lover. They are about to find out who I really am." She stood up. "Come with me, not as a warrior, as my husband." He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, at the set of her jaw. She was no longer a victim. She was a force. He nodded. "Once." They did not run. They walked. They walked out of the rocks. Two figures, caked in mud, their clothes torn, bruised and exhausted from the flood. They walked straight toward the gathering of important men. "Sheriff, look!" one of the guards shouted, pointing. Mercer spun around, his hand dropping to his gun. His face, when he saw them, was a mask of pure shock. He had assumed they were dead in the flood. "Abby," Mr. Beckett said, his voice full of false relief. "Thank God you are safe. We were just coming to rescue you." The men in the suits looked confused, turning from the burning graves to the two apparitions. "Rescue me," Abby said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden silence. "Rescue me from what, Mr. Beckett? From my husband." She came to a stop in the center of the circle, Lone Hawk at her side. She looked at the men in the suits, one by one, her gaze unflinching. "My name is Abigail Monroe," she said, "and I have been lied to, but so have you. Now, listen here, girl," Mercer snarled, stepping forward. "You are hysterical. You have been through a terrible ordeal. You do not know what you are saying." "I know exactly what I am saying," Abby said, her voice cutting through his. "You told these men that the Comanche attacked your surveyors, did you not? You told them it was an uprising." "It was," Beckett sputtered. "They killed 2 men." "They did," Abby said, and a murmur went through the crowd. "And it was a terrible, senseless act. But it was not an uprising. It was a provocation." She pointed at Beckett. "This man and Sheriff Mercer, they wanted this valley. They have wanted it all along, but they knew the government would not let them simply take it, so they had to be clever." "This is nonsense," Mercer said, his hand on his gun. "First," Abby said, ignoring him, her voice gaining strength, "they found a poor rancher, my father, Elias Monroe. They buried him in debt, threatened to take his land, and to sell his family into servitude." "Abby, stop," Lone Hawk whispered, his hand near her, afraid for her. She put her hand on his, just for a second. "No, they threatened to take my 10-year-old brother, and they offered my father a deal. His debt would be forgiven if he sold his daughter." A gasp went through the men. This was not the story they had been told. "They forced a marriage," Abby said, her voice ringing, "between me and this man, Lone Hawk, not for peace, but for paper, so they could write a story, just like the one they are telling you now, a story about civilizing the savages. They took a photograph." "This is slander," Beckett shouted, his face turning red. "Then," Abby continued, her gaze sweeping over them, "once they had their marriage, their proof of peace, they immediately, deliberately broke it. They sent surveyors to this valley to desecrate the ground where his ancestors are buried." "And you know what they were counting on?" she said, her voice dropping. "They were counting on the Comanche to be proud. They were counting on them to be angry. They were counting on exactly what happened." She pointed to Crow Ghost, still on the ridge. "They knew that warrior. Crow Ghost was hot-headed. They armed him. They gave him whiskey and rifles in secret, just to make sure he would do something stupid. They set a trap. and he walked right into it. They wanted those men to die, so they could stand here in front of you and look like heroes, so they could burn graves and call it justice. The silence was absolute. The men in the suits were looking at Mercer and Beckett, their expressions no longer sympathetic, but cold and calculating. "She is lying," Mercer said, his voice a low growl. "She has been bewitched by him. She is a traitor to her own kind." "I was," Abby said, her voice soft now, and full of a terrible shame. "I was a traitor. When I first came here, I thought these people were savages. I was raised to hate them, to fear them. I looked at them, and I saw only what I was told to see." She looked at Lone Hawk, her expression open, vulnerable. "But I was wrong. I have lived with them. They are not savages. They are people. They are families. They are proud, and they are grieving, and they are being squeezed to death by men like you." She spun on Beckett. "Men who see land, and not the graves in it. Men who see people, and only see obstacles." "Sheriff," one of the suited men said, his voice like ice, "what is the meaning of this?" Mercer knew he was losing. The story was unraveling. "The meaning is, she is a liar, and her father will tell you so." "My father," Abby said, "is a broken man, terrified of you." "Is he?" a new voice said. A figure was walking from the town, stumbling through the mud. It was Elias Monroe. He was sober for the first time in months. He was pale and shaking, but his eyes were clear. He had seen the flood. He had heard that Abby had been swept away. He had spent the night in a cold hell, believing his daughter, the one he had sold, was dead. And now, here she was, alive. He walked past Mercer, past Beckett, and he stood in front of his daughter. He looked at her, at the mud and the bruises, at the strength in her. "Pa," Abby whispered. "She is right," Elias said, his voice cracking, but it was loud. He turned to the railroad men. "Every word she said, it is true. I signed the paper. Mercer told me he would take Tommy. He told me he would put me in prison. He forced me. He paid me to be quiet. It was a lie. All of it. It was the final, devastating blow. The truth in all its ugly, pathetic glory." Mercer saw his life, his career, his fortune, all dissolving. He had one card left to play, violence. "He is a liar," Mercer roared. "They are all liars, traitors. Every one of them sees them all." He drew his pistol and pointed it, not at Lone Hawk, but at Elias. "You are under arrest, Elias, for fraud." "No!" Abby screamed. But before Mercer could fire, a new sound came, a war cry. Crow Ghost, seeing the confrontation, seeing Mercer's gun, believed the battle had finally come. He and his warriors, perhaps 20 of them, came charging down the ridge, their rifles, the ones Mercer had given them, blazing. "Now you have done it," Mercer roared, turning his gun toward the charging Comanche. "Fire, fire!" The railroad men, the hired guns, everyone dove for cover. It was chaos. A full-scale battle was about to erupt. "No," Lone Hawk shouted. He did not grab his knife. He did not run for cover. He ran into the open space, into the no-man's land between the two charging lines. He stood, his arms outstretched, his back to Mercer, his face to his own people. "Crow Ghost, stop!" he'd roared in Comanche. "It is another trick they want us to fight. They want us to die so they can win." Crow Ghost, his horse skidding to a halt, saw Lone Hawk standing alone, unarmed, a perfect target. His face was a mask of confusion and rage. The first shot in the new melee did not come from Mercer. It came from the ridge, one of Mercer's hired guns. A man who had been promised a bonus for every hostile killed fired at Crow Ghost. But at the same time, another of the hired guns, a man who was owed money by Beckett and saw his payday disappearing, decided to settle his own score. He fired. Not at the Comanche, but at Mr. Beckett, who was trying to crawl into a wagon. The bullet missed Beckett, but it ripped through a stack of papers he was carrying, including the fraudulent land grants and the doctored peace treaty. The chaos was total. It was not a battle. It was a brawl. Hired guns were shooting at hired guns, some trying to get away, others trying to loot the supply wagon. In the middle of it all, Lone Hawk and Abby saw their chance. "The real enemy!" Abby screamed, pointing, not at the Comanche, but at the chaos around the wagon. "It is not us. It is them. It is the greed. They are fighting each other for the money. Look." The men in the suits, the important men from the train, saw it. They saw Mercer, not as a lawman, but as a failed warlord, his posse collapsing into a greedy rabble. They saw Mr. Beckett, cowering in a wagon, his peace treaty a burning, scattered piece of paper. "Stop!" the lead railroad man bellowed, his voice that of a man used to command. "Stop this! In the name of the Union Pacific, all contracts are suspended. This is a disaster." Mercer, seeing the men in the suits turn against him, his authority gone, his plan in ashes, tried to slip away. But Elias Monroe, in one final, redeeming act, tackled him at the knees. The fight guttered out, as fast as it had begun. The hired guns, seeing the railroad barons turn, knew the pay was gone. They melted away. Mercer, his face in the mud, was arrested by his own deputy. Beckett was detained by the railroad men, his career over. The sacred valley was silent, save for the smoking embers of the graves. Crow Ghost sat on his horse, his rifle lowered. He looked at the chaos. He looked at Mercer being tied up. And he looked at Lone Hawk, who was standing, his chest still heaving, in the center of the field. He did not understand what had happened. He had come for a battle of honor, and he had found a brawl over paper. Lone Hawk met his gaze. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a deep, profound sadness for the graves that had been burned. Crow Ghost looked at his enemy, his rival, and he saw a man who had just saved them, not with a rifle, but with a truth. He saw a man who had stood, unarmed, between two armies. He did not nod. He did not offer peace, but he slowly, deliberately, lowered his rifle, turned his horse, and led his men back into the hills. It was not forgiveness, but it was, perhaps, a grudging, silent respect. Abby walked to Lone Hawk, her legs shaking. She stood beside him. She put her muddy hand in his. They were both covered in filth, bruised and exhausted, but they were standing. She looked at her father, who was being helped up, a look of dazed, pained relief on his face. She looked at the smoking valley. She looked at the retreating warriors. She had chosen her side. It was not the town. It was not the tribe. It was this man. It was the truth. The smoke from the burning graves stained the sky for a day, but the fire of Mercer's and Beckett's careers was extinguished in an afternoon. The truth, spoken by a woman in muddy buckskins and a broken man seeking one last piece of his soul, had been more powerful than a company of soldiers. News traveled fast on the telegraph, but the version that went back east this time was not the one Beckett had written. It was the one told by the horrified and very powerful railroad barons from the train. They spoke of fraud, of land grabbing, of an agent who had armed hostiles, and of a sheriff who had started a riot. An official investigation was launched, one that was not interested in lies. A few months later, the world had shifted. The railroad, its reputation on the line, made a great show of its integrity. The route was changed. It would now go around the sacred valley, a detour that cost them millions, but which served as a public apology. The sacred valley, though scarred by fire, was left in peace. The graves were rebuilt, the scaffolds raised once more, in a long, quiet ceremony of mourning and renewal. Mercer was gone, tried and imprisoned, not for his crimes against the Comanche, but for his fraud against the railroad. Beckett had vanished, disappearing back east in disgrace. In the new, uneasy vacuum, a new idea was born. Not peace, for that was too large a word, but a truce. A new trading post was established, not in San Miguel, but on a neutral patch of ground by the creek that marked the border. It was a place for business. The Comanche, their land now marginally more secure, brought hides and well-trained horses. The townsfolk, wary but practical, brought salt, flour, and coffee. On a low hill, set back from the prairie, a new home was built. It was not a teepee, and it was not a ranch house. It was a small, sturdy cabin made of sod and river stone, with a wide, solid porch. It sat on the ridgeline, a place where, if you stood on the porch, you could look one way and see the scattered lodges of the Comanche camp, and look the other and see the distant, flickering lights of San Miguel. It was a house that belonged to both worlds, and to neither. This was where Abby and Lone Hawk lived. Life settled into a new rhythm, one of peace. The days were filled with work, but it was the work of building, not of surviving. One afternoon, a small delegation arrived at the cabin. It was Tommy, his face bright, his old fear gone. He was leading a horse, and behind him, his head bowed, was Elias Monroe. Lone Hawk, who had been mending a bridle, saw them first. He stood, his face unreadable. Abby came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. She saw her father, and her brother, and her heart, which had been so full of anger and betrayal, felt a strange, quiet pull. "Tommy," she said, a smile breaking on her face. Tommy ran to her, and she hugged him, lifting him off the ground. He was safe. He was healthy. Lone Hawk, seeing this, walked over to the boy. He did not speak, but he looked at Tommy, and then at the horse. "You ride?" he asked. "Some," Tommy said, his voice full of awe. "Not like that," Lone Hawk said, his voice gruff, but not unkind. He mounted his own horse in a single, fluid motion. He gestured. "Come, I will teach you to ride like a man." Tommy looked at Abby, who nodded. He scrambled onto his horse and followed Lone Hawk onto the prairie. Two very different figures, riding toward the same horizon. Abby was left on the porch with her father. Elias stood twisting his hat in his hands. He looked old. He had not, she knew, touched a bottle of whiskey since the day of the flood. He was a sober man, and the weight of his past was a heavy, clear-eyed burden. "Abby," he began, his voice rough. I do not expect you to understand. I do not expect you to forgive me." "I am listening, Pa," she said. "I was a coward," he said, the words spilling out, a confession he had been practicing for months. "I was weak, I was scared, and I sold you. I sold my own daughter. I looked at Mercer's gun, and I failed. It was the last, worst thing in a long line of failings." He looked up, his eyes, for the first time, clear and full of a terrible, honest pain. "I thought you were dead, in that flood, and in that night. I realized I had not just lost my land. I had lost my soul, and you—" He stopped, unable to go on. Abby looked at him, at this man who had given her life, and who had nearly taken it. She thought of the cave, of the cold, of the word pity. She thought of her father's face as he lied for Mercer, and she felt nothing. The anger was gone. It had been washed away in the flood. All that was left was a deep, quiet sadness. "I forgive you, Pa," she said. He let out a choked sob, a sound of relief so profound it shook his whole body. "Abby, I forgive you," she said, stepping forward. But she did not hug him. "But you need to understand. My home, it is not your ranch. It is not San Miguel. It is no longer in those four walls where Mama died. My home is here, on this hill." He looked at her, and then at the cabin, and he understood. He had not just lost a daughter. She had become a woman, in a world he could not enter. "I know," he said, nodding, wiping his eyes. "I know. I had to tell you. I had to say it. And Tommy, he is safe. The ranch is gone. The bank took it. But we have a small room in town. I am working. For the blacksmith. It is honest." "Good," Abby said, a small, true smile touching her lips. "That is good. Pa." They stood in silence for a moment, the sound of laughter drifting up from the prairie, where Lone Hawk was showing a delighted Tommy how to hang off the side of his horse while galloping. "He looks happy," Elias said, his voice full of wonder. "The boy, he is not afraid." "No," Abby said, looking out at her husband and her brother. "No one is afraid here." The seasons turned. The first snow fell, and the world went quiet. The cabin was warm. The small, rebuilt Comanche camp was peaceful. The town, humbled and focused on its own survival, kept its distance. One night, a year after that first terrible night, Abby and Lone Hawk were sitting by their fire. It was a cold, clear night, the stars so bright they looked like holes punched in a black, velvet sky. A year. Abby was mending one of his shirts, the firelight catching the copper of her braided hair. She smiled, a small, private smile. "What is it?" he asked. He was carving a piece of wood, his hands, which she had once thought so rough, moving with incredible, gentle precision. "I was just thinking," she said, "about our wedding night." He looked up, his face unreadable in the firelight. "I remember." "You do," she said, a teasing note in her voice. "I was thinking you must be the only Comanche husband in the entire territory who, on his wedding night, gave his new wife a knife, his best horse, and then went outside to sleep by the fire." He watched her for a long moment. The lines around his eyes softened, and then a small, slow, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was the first time she had ever truly seen him smile. It transformed his face. "I was scared," he said, his voice a low rumble. She laughed. "You were scared you had a knife. I was the one in a strange dress in a strange lodge." "No," he said, and his smile faded, replaced by the deep, raw honesty she had come to know in the dark of the canyon. "I was scared. I was not scared of you. I was scared of me." He put down his carving. "I looked at you, and you were a thing, a piece of property, just like they said, and I knew if I kept you, if I touched you, when you were that afraid, if I held you against your will, even though the law said you were mine, I would be just like them. I would be just like the men who stole my land because a piece of paper said it was theirs." He reached out and touched her hand, the one holding the needle. "I was scared I would become the man I hated." Abby put her sewing down. She moved across the small space and sat beside him on the warm hearthstone, her shoulder pressed against his. "You are not that man," she whispered. "You were never that man." "Because you stayed," he said, his voice simple. They sat in silence, a comfortable, shared quiet. The only sound the crackle of the fire and the low whistle of the wind outside. After a long time, she leaned her head on his shoulder. His arm came around her, pulling her close, his hand, calloused and strong, covered hers in her lap. She looked at their joined hands, her pale skin against his dark, and she saw not two worlds, but one. "It is late," she said, her voice soft. "It is," he agreed. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. He looked at her, his eyes full of a quiet warmth that was more powerful than any fire. He did not say, "I love you." He did not have to. He blew out the lamp, plunging the small cabin into darkness, lit only by the red embers of the fire. And in the warm, safe dark, he led her to their bed, and he closed the door. The next spring, when the ground was soft, they planted a tree. It was a small, fragile cottonwood sapling, dug from the banks of the new, peaceful creek. They planted it on the hill, right by their cabin, where it could see both the camp and the town. "What should we call it?" Abby asked. packing the dark earth around its base. She looked at the small, green leaves, trembling in the wind. We should call it freedom. Lone Hawk, leaning on his shovel, looked at her. Freedom, he said, testing the word. He looked at the cabin, his home. He looked at the valley, his land. I would call it home. They looked at each other, a quiet disagreement. Abby smiled. You know, she said, when I ran away, all I wanted was freedom. When you found me, all I wanted was a home. She looked at the little tree, a speck of green against the vast, blue sky. Let us call it New Dawn, because it is both. He looked at her, at this woman who had been sold to him at 19, so full of fire and fear, and a strength he had never known. She had not been a debt. She had not been a thing of pity. She had been his new dawn. New dawn, he agreed, and he took her hand. Out here, in the vast, hard country where the railroad was still tearing the world in two, there were 1,000 stories of guns and gold and blood. But this was not one of them. This was a story, whispered on the wind, of a girl who had been sold, and a poor warrior who had done the most shocking thing of all. He had offered her a choice, and together, in a land that tried to tell them they had no future, they had chosen to build one where neither of them, ever again, would have to bow their heads. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from. Please let us know in the comments, and share your thoughts on Abby and Lone Hawk's journey. Your subscription to Wild West Tales means the world to us, so please subscribe, like this video, and hit that hype button. It helps more than you know, and it ensures these stories can be heard by many more.